In the coded lines of early game files, in the quiet margins of developer interviews, in the overlooked text boxes that most players skip through without reading, there exist details that rarely surface in conversation. These are the facts that linger in the background, the design choices made in offices late at night, the programming decisions that shaped how we experience these creatures. Some of these details are strange, others are surprisingly dark, and a few rewrite assumptions we've carried since childhood. Before we drift any further, maybe tap subscribe for more gentle videos, and let me know where you're listening from tonight. We begin with a detail about family that most players never notice, something hidden in plain sight across nearly every generation of the main series games. Ruby and Sapphire stand alone as the only main series Pokémon games where your character's father appears as a visible character in the world. In almost every other generation, your father exists only as an absence, mentioned briefly in journal entries or passing dialogue from your mother, but never seen, never met. The tradition of the fatherless protagonist runs deep through the series, creating an unspoken narrative that to become the very best, to chase greatness across regions and mountains, you must do so without a father's guidance or presence. This pattern feels deliberate, almost mythological in its consistency. The hero's journey requires separation from the familiar, from the comforts of home and parental protection. But Ruby and Sapphire broke that pattern by making Norman, your father, the fifth gym leader you face. He's not just mentioned, but fully realized, a character with a role in both your story and the world's structure. The decision to include him visibly was unusual enough that it became one of the defining characteristics of Hoenn's narrative structure, setting those games apart from the established formula. The absence of fathers in other games creates a specific emotional landscape, one where your mother waves goodbye from the doorway, where Professor Oak or Elm or Birch becomes a surrogate guide, where your rival might have a sister or grandfather, but your own family remains small and incomplete. This narrative choice speaks to something deeper about independence and the journey away from childhood, about leaving behind everything familiar to prove yourself in a world that doesn't care about your lineage or your past. Norman's presence in Ruby and Sapphire offered something different, a reconciliation of family and ambition, a father who supports your journey by testing you properly, by refusing to go easy just because you're his child. The battle against him carries weight that other gym battles don't, emotional stakes that go beyond badges and progress. You're not just proving yourself to the world, but to your father, and his acceptance of your victory feels like a genuine moment of growth rather than another checkbox on the path to the Elite Four. The pattern returned in later generations, fathers once again fading into journal entries and background mentions, confirming that Norman's appearance was an exception rather than a new direction. The series returned to what it understood best, the solitary journey of a young trainer making their way through a world that belongs more to Pokémon than to families or traditional structures. Before you settle in, maybe tap subscribe for more calm stories, and share where in the world you're watching from tonight. Beneath the surface of Kanto's roots, under the ground where most players never think to look, Diglett has been hiding something that the games never quite revealed. For generations, the question lingered without answer, a mystery so fundamental that it became a running joke in the community. What does a Diglett look like below ground? The sprite shows only a small brown head with a pink nose, emerging from earth that seems to go down forever. The bottom remains unseen, unknowable, a deliberate choice by designers who understood that sometimes mystery is more valuable than revelation. But in Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Rescue Team Die X, a small line of dialogue quietly confirmed what many had wondered, but few expected the games to address. A Diglett mentions, almost casually, that it has feet. The revelation comes without fanfare, without visual confirmation, leaving the appearance of those feats as still unknown, still subject to imagination and speculation. Pikachu's reaction in the game mirrors the player's own surprise, a moment of genuine bewilderment that something so basic about Diglett's anatomy had gone unmentioned for so long. The mention of feet raises more questions than it answers. Are they small and vestigial, barely used as Diglett tunnels through soil? Are they powerful and clawed, designed for digging? Do they resemble mole paws or something more unusual, something that would explain Diglett's incredible speed underground? The game offers no images, no further details, preserving the mystery while acknowledging that yes, beneath that visible head, there is more to Diglett than we've been shown. This approach to revelation feels very much in line with how Pokémon handles its stranger design choices. The series rarely explains itself explicitly, preferring to let players piece together details from scattered Pokédex entries, character comments, and environmental clues. Diglett's feet exist now in confirmed canon, but they remain invisible, existing in the space between what we know and what we can prove. The mental images players create vary wildly, from realistic mole anatomy to more surreal possibilities, to interpretations that turn Diglett into something far stranger than its innocent appearance suggests. The fact that this detail emerged in a spin off rather than a main series game feels appropriate somehow. Mystery Dungeon games have always been more willing to explore the inner lives and thoughts of Pokémon, giving them dialogue and personalities that the main games only hint at. In allowing Diglett to mention its feet, the game acknowledged a long-standing fan question while maintaining the essential mystery, confirming existence without demanding revelation. The feet are real, but they remain hidden, and perhaps that's exactly how it should be. What makes this detail particularly interesting is how it recontextualizes every Diglett and Dugtrio encounter in the main games. When they emerge from the ground in battle, are those feet tucked underneath, invisible in the sprite's limited space? When they move, are they walking or tunneling or doing something that doesn't quite map to human understanding of locomotion? The confirmation of feet doesn't settle these questions, but instead opens new avenues for speculation, new ways of thinking about creatures we thought we understood completely. In the months before Pokémon, the first movie released in American theaters, studio executives looked at the film's potential and saw an opportunity to maximize profits through celebrity casting. The plan was simple and ruthless. Replace the voice actors who had brought the anime to life, who had established these characters in the minds of young audiences, with recognizable Hollywood names that could fill seats and generate media attention. The list of proposed replacements included some of the biggest stars of the late 90s, names that would have transformed the film from an animated feature into a celebrity vehicle. Leonardo DiCaprio was slated to voice Ash Ketchum, a choice that feels almost surreal in retrospect. DiCaprio was coming off Titanic, one of the highest-grossing films ever made, and his involvement would have guaranteed media coverage and mainstream attention. But the tonal mismatch between DiCaprio's established screen persona and Ash's earnest, childlike enthusiasm would have created something deeply strange, a disconnect between voice and character that might have undermined the film's emotional core. Imagining DiCaprio's voice coming from Ash's animated form creates a kind of cognitive dissonance, a clash of associations that no amount of acting skill could fully resolve. The studio's logic was purely commercial, driven by the belief that celebrity names sold tickets regardless of fit or appropriateness. But the decision to keep the original voice cast came from creators who understood that continuity mattered, that the voices audiences had come to associate with these characters through the television series were essential to maintaining the film's connection to its established world. Replacing Veronica Taylor, Rachel Lillis, and Eric Stewart with celebrities would have severed that connection, turning the movie into something separate from the show, rather than an extension of it. This tension between artistic integrity and commercial pressure plays out constantly in media production, particularly in properties aimed at children, where studios often assume that young audiences won't notice or care about changes in voice actors. But Pokemon's fan base, even in the late 90s, was deeply invested in consistency, in the feeling that the anime and games and cards all existed in the same coherent universe. Changing the voices would have broken that coherence, creating a film that felt like a cash grab rather than a genuine continuation of Ash's journey. The decision to keep the original cast allowed the first movie to function as a proper culmination of the anime's first season, a story that built on relationships and character development that had unfolded over dozens of episodes. Ash's bond with Pikachu, Misty and Brock's friendship with him, Team Rocket's bumbling villainy, all of these dynamics depended on vocal performances that audiences recognized and trusted. Celebrity voices might have brought more attention to the film, but they would have undermined its emotional stakes, turning sincere moments into something that felt calculated and hollow. Looking back at the studio's proposed casting reveals how differently Pokemon's American release could have unfolded, how close the franchise came to being treated as just another opportunity for celebrity driven marketing rather than a property worth preserving on its own terms. The success of the first movie, with its original cast, vindicated the decision to maintain continuity, proving that audiences responded to authenticity and emotional investment rather than just recognizable names. The film became one of the highest grossing anime movies in American history, accomplishing exactly what the studio wanted, but through different means than they had planned. The quiet darkness woven through Pokemon's world reveals itself in unexpected places, in Pokédex entries that describe behavior too disturbing for a children's game, in item descriptions that imply violence or consumption, in the unspoken reality that these creatures exist in an ecosystem where some must eat and others must be eaten. The games rarely address this directly, preferring to maintain a veneer of wholesomeness, but the implications surface in scattered references that accumulate into an undeniable truth. People in the Pokemon world eat Pokemon, and the evidence of this practice exists across multiple generations of games. Gold and Silver introduced the concept through Team Rocket's scheme in Azalea Town, where criminals harvested slowpoke tails to sell as expensive delicacies. The game presents this as villainy, as cruelty worth stopping, but the existence of a market for slowpoke tails implies that somewhere, someone is buying and consuming them. The tails are described as rare and valuable, suggesting a culinary tradition that predates Team Rocket's involvement, a cultural practice that the games acknowledge without fully exploring. The Slowpoke themselves regenerate their tails, a detail that makes the practice less horrific, but no less strange, creating a sustainable source of meat that comes from living creatures who continue their lives diminished but alive. Sword and Shield made the reality more explicit through the curry cooking system, a feature that encouraged players to gather ingredients and prepare meals at campsites throughout the Galar region. The ingredient list included items whose origins couldn't be anything other than Pokemon. Smoked poketails, brittle bones, sausages, pre-cooked burgers, all of these suggest animal products derived from creatures that in other contexts would be partners and friends. The game never shows the source of these ingredients, never depicts the process of butchering or preparation, but the implication sits unavoidably in the player's inventory, in the cheerful cooking animations that gloss over questions of ethics and necessity. The curry ingredient images sometimes revealed more than the text descriptions, showing what appeared to be a crabby or kingler partially submerged in sauce, alongside what looked distinctly like shrimp. These visual details created uncomfortable moments for players who noticed them, moments where the game's usual separation between Pokemon as companions and Pokemon as resources collapsed into uneasy coexistence. The curry system treated these ingredients as natural and uncontroversial, as ordinary components of a meal that your Pokemon would happily consume alongside you, creating a cognitive dissonance that the game never acknowledged or resolved. Other references scattered through the series reinforce this reality without making it explicit. Pokédex entries mention Pidgey and Spearow as common prey for larger Pokémon, implying a food chain where some species exist primarily as meals for others. Fishing yields Magikarp that certain NPCs describe as bony and unappetizing but edible, suggesting that humans have attempted to eat them and found them wanting. The existence of restaurants and cafes throughout various regions implies a cuisine that must include some form of protein, and in a world where Pokemon have largely replaced traditional animals, the source of that protein becomes difficult to ignore. The games maintain their innocence by never showing the act of consumption, never depicting a plate of cooked Pokemon or a market stall selling cuts of Tauros meat. This absence allows younger players to remain unaware, while older players notice the implications and draw their own conclusions. It's a careful balance, acknowledging the logical reality of an ecosystem where creatures must eat while refusing to make that reality visible or undeniable. The evidence exists for those who look for it, scattered across item descriptions and NPC dialogue and cooking menus, but it never intrudes into the main narrative, never forces players to confront questions they might prefer to avoid. This approach reflects a broader tension in Pokemon's world building, the need to create a functioning ecosystem while maintaining the fantasy that Pokemon are too special, too intelligent, too much like friends to be reduced to resources. The series wants to have it both ways, to present a world that feels real and complete while protecting the emotional core of the player-Pokemon relationship. The result is a setting where the evidence of Pokemon consumption exists but remains peripheral, acknowledged but never centered, present but carefully managed to avoid disrupting the player's experience of companionship and adventure. If you're still awake halfway through, maybe subscribe before you drift off and tell me what time it is where you're watching from. Poliwag's design carries a detail that most players never question, accepting the spiral on its stomach as an abstract pattern, a visual element that distinguishes it from other water types. But that spiral has a specific origin, drawn from real biology in a way that makes Poliwag simultaneously more realistic and more unsettling. The Pokemon is based on tadpoles, with translucent stomachs, a characteristic found in certain species where the developing digestive system remains visible through thin, nearly transparent skin. The spiral represents intestines, internal organs rendered visible, turned into a design element that children can look at without realizing they're seeing a stylized depiction of anatomy. This connection between game design and biological reality appears throughout Pokemon, particularly in the earlier generations, where creatures often drew directly from specific animals or natural phenomena. Game Freak's designers researched their subjects carefully, finding unusual details that could be abstracted into appealing character designs. Poliwag's intestinal spiral works because it's been simplified and stylized enough to become decorative rather than graphic, transformed from a biological fact into a visual motif that serves the character's overall aesthetic. The spiral moves in Poliwag's animations, suggesting motion and life, turning internal organs into something dynamic and characterful. The choice to base Poliwag on this specific type of tadpole reveals the level of detail that went into early Pokemon designs, the willingness to research unusual creatures and find elements that could translate into game sprites. The translucent stomach of certain tadpole species is a genuinely striking feature, one that makes these small amphibians look almost alien, their insides on display in a way that seems unnatural for a living thing. By incorporating this feature into Poliwag, the designers created a Pokemon that feels both cute and slightly strange, recognizable as a tadpole while possessing qualities that set it apart from generic depictions of amphibian young. The evolution line reinforces this biological grounding, with Poliwhirl and Poliwrath maintaining the spiral as a central design element, even as the creatures grow more humanoid and less tadpole-like. The persistence of the spiral suggests that what began as intestines has become something else, perhaps a pattern in the skin or a marking that serves some evolutionary purpose. The ambiguity allows the design to mature while maintaining visual continuity, keeping the most distinctive element of Poliwag's appearance while transforming its meaning and presentation. By the time Poliwag evolves into Poliwrath, the spiral feels less like visible organs and more like a birthmark or natural pattern, the biological origin obscured by stylization and evolution. This kind of transformation, taking something potentially unsettling from nature and rendering it cute or appealing, defines much of Pokemon's early design philosophy. The games needed creatures that would work in a children's context, that could be marketed on toys and cards and television shows, but they also wanted designs that felt grounded in real biology, that drew from the natural world in ways that gave them weight and believability. Poliwag succeeds on both fronts, cute enough to appeal to young players while carrying enough biological detail to interest older audiences who appreciate the research and thought behind the design. The franchise almost ended before it could become a cultural phenomenon, before the hundreds of millions of dollars in merchandise and movies and games could accumulate into the highest grossing media franchise in history. Gold and Silver were supposed to be the conclusion, the final chapter in a story that had begun with Red and Blue. The developers at Game Freak viewed these games as a definitive ending, a return to Kanto alongside the new Johto region, a farewell to the world they had created. The ambition packed into Gold and Silver reflects this mindset, the determination to include everything they could imagine, to make these games a comprehensive conclusion to Pokemon as a concept. But Tsunekazu Ishihara, the CEO of the Pokemon Company at the time, saw potential that the developers themselves questioned. He believed the franchise could continue, that there was appetite for more regions, more creatures, more adventures. The decision to greenlight Ruby and Sapphire was a gamble, a bet that players would embrace a third generation of Pokemon even after Gold and Silver had provided such a complete and satisfying conclusion. This wasn't a safe decision or an obvious one. The market was untested, and there was real risk that players would view additional generations as unnecessary or cash grabbing, diluting the franchise rather than expanding it. The success of Ruby and Sapphire vindicated Ishihara's gamble in ways that transformed not just Pokemon, but the entire approach to long-running game franchises. The realization that players would accept, even demand, continuous new generations established a model that Pokemon has followed ever since, with each new generation bringing fresh regions and creatures while maintaining the core formula that made the series successful. So this ongoing structure has allowed Pokemon to remain relevant for over 2 decades, constantly renewing itself while preserving the elements that define the experience. The alternate timeline where Pokemon ended with Gold and Silver is fascinating to consider. A world where 151 Pokemon became 251 and then stopped, where Johto marked the final word on the franchise's world building and design philosophy. In that timeline, Pokemon might have remained a beloved but concluded series, something that defined a particular moment in gaming history before gracefully ending. The decision to continue changed everything, establishing Pokemon as a perpetual franchise, one that could theoretically continue forever as long as new ideas and regions could be developed. This shift from concluded story to ongoing franchise brought both benefits and challenges, allowing for continuous innovation and fresh experiences while also creating pressure to maintain quality and interest across increasingly numerous generations. The later generations have had to work harder to justify their existence, to prove that they offer something new and worthwhile rather than simply retreating familiar ground. Some have succeeded more than others, but the fundamental choice to continue beyond gold and silver, to take that risk and trust that players would follow, shaped the modern gaming landscape in ways that extend far beyond Pokemon itself. The gambling mechanics that once defined Pokemon's game corners disappeared from later generations, removed in response to evolving standards around gambling content in games aimed at children. The slot machines that filled the Celadon and Mobile game corners, where players could spend hours trying to win coins for valuable TMs and rare Pokemon, represented a feature that felt normal in the late 90s and early 2000s, but became increasingly controversial as awareness of gambling's addictive potential grew. The removal of these mechanics marked a shift in how the series approached content that might be seen as inappropriate or harmful. The Emerald slot machines particularly captured players' attention, with their Pikachu and Pokeball symbols creating moments of genuine excitement when the reels aligned. The mechanics were simple enough for children to understand, while complex enough to create the same dopamine responses that make adult gambling addictive. Players could spend hours at these machines, watching coins accumulate or disappear, chasing the rare outcomes that would let them purchase TMs for moves like Thunderbolt or Ice Beam. The game corner became a destination, a place where progress could be made through patience and luck rather than battling and exploration. But the controversy around these features grew as countries began implementing stricter regulations about gambling content in media aimed at minors. The European Ratings Board eventually classified games with simulated gambling differently, creating pressure for Game Freak to remove or modify these mechanics to avoid higher age ratings. The change came gradually, with later games first removing the actual slot machines and replacing them with simpler minigames, then eventually eliminating the game corner concept entirely. Modern Pokemon games no longer include any mechanics that could be classified as gambling, a response to both regulatory pressure and changing cultural attitudes. The loss of the game corner removed a distinctive element of the Pokemon world, a place that felt adult and slightly dangerous in a way that contrasted with the rest of the game's family-friendly content. The presence of gambling in a children's game created an interesting tension, acknowledging that the Pokemon world included activities and spaces that weren't appropriate for young trainers while still making them accessible to players. The removal of these features made the games safer and more universally appropriate, but it also made them slightly more sanitized, less willing to include elements that existed outside the central narrative of friendship and adventure. The replacement minigames that appeared in later generations, Voltorb Flip in Heart Gold and Soul Silver being the most notable example, attempted to preserve the game corner concept while removing the gambling mechanics. These alternatives were less popular, lacking the simple appeal and risk-reward structure that made the original slots so engaging. Players tolerated them as a way to obtain prizes, but rarely embraced them with the same enthusiasm, viewing them as inferior substitutes for what had been lost. The eventual complete removal of the game corner acknowledged what these compromises had proven, that the feature couldn't survive in a form that both satisfied players and met modern content standards. Names carry meaning and associations that can make or break a character design, and the process of naming Pokémon involves careful consideration of sound, cultural resonance, and trademark availability. Vulpix, the small fire-type fox, nearly entered the English versions of the games under a different name, one that would have connected it to different associations and given it a different place in players' minds. The original planned name was Foxfire, a term that references both the fox itself and the phenomenon of bioluminescent fungi that glow in forests at night, creating an eerie, mystical light that resembles flame. Foxfire, as a name, carried poetry and atmosphere, evoking images of mysterious lights in dark woods, of supernatural occurrences, and folklore. But it also presented problems, primarily in its length and the associations it carried outside the Pokemon context. The name felt almost too literary, too weighted with meaning for a creature that needed to function as a cute, accessible starter level Pokemon that players would encounter early in their journey. The developers ultimately decided that Foxfire didn't quite fit, that it created expectations or associations that the actual design couldn't fully support. The replacement name, Vulpix, solved these problems through elegant simplification. Vulpes, the Latin word for fox, combined with pix, suggesting both a small, cute thing and the number 6, referring to the Pokemon's 6 tails. The name felt simultaneously sophisticated and playful, grounded in classical language while remaining accessible and easy to pronounce. Vulpix rolls off the tongue more naturally than Foxfire, fitting better into the established pattern of Pokemon names that blend multiple meanings into compact, memorable packages. This naming process plays out for every Pokemon, with early concepts often going through multiple iterations before settling on the final version. Some names work immediately, feeling right from the first suggestion, while others require extensive revision and testing. The goal is always to create names that work across multiple languages and cultural contexts, that don't create unfortunate associations or pronunciation difficulties in major markets. Vulpix succeeded on these fronts, becoming one of the more universally recognized and beloved Pokemon names, a choice that feels inevitable in retrospect, but could easily have gone differently. The fact that Foxfire was seriously considered, nearly used, suggests an alternate version of the franchise, where names skewed slightly more literary, more willing to reference folklore and natural phenomena directly rather than through clever wordplay. That version of Pokemon might have felt different in subtle ways, slightly more grounded in real world mythology, and less focused on creating its own internal logic and naming conventions. The choice to go with Vulpix instead helped establish the naming style that would define the series, favoring compact, playful names that balanced multiple meanings over single words with strong but potentially limiting associations. In the Pokemon anime's 7th season, an episode titled A Haunted House for Everyone introduced a character that existed in a category all its own, unprecedented and never repeated. Mimikins, a shiny Mimikyu, appeared not as a living Pokemon, but as the ghost of a deceased one, a spirit that had died but remained present, haunting the world it could no longer properly inhabit. Unlike regular Mimikyu, which are ghost-type Pokemon that wear disguises to hide their true forms, Mimikins was an actual ghost, capable of floating freely through the air and passing through solid objects in ways that living Mimikyu cannot. The concept of a Pokemon that has died and returned as a ghost, separate from ghost-type Pokemon, creates fascinating complications for the series' cosmology. Ghost-type Pokemon like Ghastly or Haunter are alive in their own way, physical beings with ghost-type characteristics rather than spirits of deceased creatures. Mimikins represented something different, a Pokemon that had experienced death and continued existing beyond it, maintaining its personality and memories while gaining abilities that regular Mimikyu don't possess. The distinction matters because it suggests that Pokemon, like humans in the anime's world, can die and leave ghosts. That death in this universe isn't simply a state change, but a transformation that allows for continued existence in altered form. The episode treated Mimikin's status matter-of-factly, acknowledging its nature as a ghost without dwelling on the implications or the circumstances of its death. The Pokémon helped characters in the episode, using its ability to pass through walls and float to accomplish tasks that living Pokémon couldn't manage. This practical approach to supernatural existence fit the anime's usual tone, where strange occurrences are accepted and integrated into the story rather than questioned or analyzed. Mimikins appeared, helped, and then presumably continued its ghostly existence after the episode ended, its fate left unresolved. The uniqueness of Mimikins raises questions about why this concept hasn't appeared elsewhere in the franchise, why other episodes or games haven't explored the idea of Pokemon ghosts separate from ghost types. The simplest explanation is that the concept creates complications that the series generally prefers to avoid, raising questions about death and afterlife that don't fit comfortably in a franchise aimed at children. Mimikins worked in a single episode, a brief exploration of an idea that was then set aside, but making ghost Pokemon a regular occurrence would fundamentally change how death functions in the series, requiring explanations and world building that might undermine the lighter tone. The episode's willingness to include Mimikins despite these complications suggests that the anime, particularly in its middle seasons, was willing to take creative risks that the games avoided. The anime has always had slightly more freedom to explore unusual concepts, to include one-off characters and situations that exist outside the established rules. Mimikins represents this freedom at its most interesting. A character that shouldn't exist according to the series' normal logic, but does anyway, appearing for 20 minutes before disappearing back into whatever space ghost Pokemon occupy when they're not actively haunting. The move Splash has caused confusion for decades, its name suggesting an association with water that the actual mechanics don't support. The move does nothing in battle, wasting a turn without accomplishing anything useful, and it can be learned by Pokemon that have no connection to aquatic environments. Hoppip, a grass type that floats on winds, can learn Splash. Spoink, a psychic type pig, can learn Splash. The pattern makes no sense until you understand the translation issue that created this confusion, a case where the English name obscured the move's actual meaning. In Japanese, the move is called Hanaru, which can translate as either splash or hop depending on context. The primary meaning is actually closer to hop or jump, describing a bouncing or leaping motion rather than anything specifically related to water. This explains why non-water types can learn the move, why it appears in the move pools of Pokemon that would never voluntarily enter water. They're not splashing in the sense of playing in water. They're hopping uselessly, expending energy without accomplishing anything strategic. The move represents enthusiasm without effectiveness, motion without purpose. This translation choice, selecting splash over hop for the English version, created a disconnect that has persisted through every generation of the games. Players encountering splash for the first time naturally assume it's a water-type move, that it should have some effect related to water, or at least be limited to aquatic Pokemon. The reality that it does nothing and can be learned by creatures that would never touch water feels like a mistake, like something the developers overlooked. But it's not a mistake. It's a consequence of trying to translate a word with multiple meanings into a language where those meanings require different words. The move's interaction with gravity, the psychic type move that increases the weight of all Pokemon on the battlefield, provides further evidence of Splash's true nature. When gravity is in effect, Splash becomes disabled, unusable, until the gravity effect ends. This makes no sense. If Splash is about water, as gravity shouldn't prevent a Pokemon from making water-related movements. But if Splash is about hopping or jumping, about launching yourself briefly into the air, then gravity's effect becomes perfectly logical. Increased gravity would prevent jumping, would keep Pokemon grounded and unable to perform leaping motions. The mechanical interaction supports the Japanese meaning rather than the English translation. This kind of translation complication appears throughout the series, cases where English names or descriptions don't quite capture the full meaning or intent of the original Japanese. Sometimes these disconnects are minor, creating slight confusion that players can work around. Other times, as with Splash, they fundamentally change how players understand a move or Pokemon, creating expectations that the actual mechanics don't fulfill. The persistence of these translation choices across generations suggests that fixing them would create more confusion than allowing them to continue, that players have adapted to the quirks and inconsistencies well enough that changing them now would feel more disruptive than helpful. The audio design of Red and Blue operated under constraints that shaped the game's soundscape in ways that still feel distinctive decades later. The Game Boy's limited sound capabilities forced composers and sound designers to work within strict technical boundaries, and the Pokemon cries, the vocalizations that each creature makes when encountered or sent into battle, had to be created from an extremely limited pool of source sounds. The entire roster of 151 Pokemon drew from only 37 unique sound clips, manipulated and modified to create the illusion of variety. These 37 base sounds were pitched up, pitched down, sped up, slowed down, reversed, and layered to create distinct cries for each Pokemon. A single source sound might serve as the basis for 5 or 6 different Pokemon cries, each modification creating enough difference that players wouldn't immediately recognize the connection. The technique worked remarkably well, with most players accepting the cries as unique to each Pokemon without questioning how they were generated. Only when examining the sounds closely, when comparing them directly, or analyzing them with audio software, does the limited source material become apparent. This audio recycling created unintentional family resemblances between Pokemon that had no narrative or evolutionary connection, creatures that shared modified versions of the same base cry sounding similar in ways that suggested relationships the games never explicitly established. Some players noticed these similarities and assumed they meant something, that Pokemon with similar cries were related or connected in the game's lore. In reality, the connections were purely technical, a consequence of working within the Game Boy's limitations rather than a deliberate design choice meant to convey information. The approach to Pokemon cries evolved in later generations as hardware improved and more sophisticated audio became possible. The Game Boy Advance could handle more complex sounds, allowing for cries that weren't simply pitched versions of a small sample pool. By the Nintendo DS era, Pokemon cries had become more elaborate and distinct, each creature's vocalization crafted to match its design and character rather than being constrained by technical limitations. But the cries from Red and Blue maintained a certain charm, a lo-fi quality that became nostalgic for players who grew up with those games, that defined the audio identity of the franchise in its earliest form. The decision to preserve the original cries in remakes like Fire Red and Leaf Green, rather than replacing them with higher quality versions, acknowledged this nostalgia and the importance of audio continuity. Players expected to hear those specific sounds when encountering a Kanto Pokemon, regardless of how limited or technically crude they might be by modern standards. The cries became part of each Pokemon's identity, inseparable from the overall experience of the games. Changing them would have felt like a betrayal, like removing something essential, even if the replacements were objectively better quality. Spoink's existence depends on continuous motion, a biological fact that turns what could be a cute, bouncing Pokemon into something quietly horrifying. According to its Pokédex entries, Spoink must never stop bouncing, not because it enjoys the motion or because bouncing is its preferred method of movement, but because the shock of each bounce is what makes its heart pump. The rhythm of impact and rebound drives its circulatory system, providing the mechanical stimulus that keeps blood flowing through its body. If Spoink were to stop bouncing, its heart would stop beating, and the Pokémon would die. This detail transforms every Spoink encounter from a simple battle into a moment of existential concern. When you put Spoink to sleep with a move like Sleep Powder or Hypnosis, is it still bouncing? The game doesn't show sleeping Pokémon bouncing, suggesting that sleep somehow suspends the need for constant motion, that Spoink's body can maintain itself during unconsciousness in ways it can't during waking hours. But the Pokédex entries never address this contradiction, never explain how Spoink can sleep or rest or exist in any state other than continuous bouncing without suffering cardiac arrest. The evolutionary line offers a resolution to this grim biology, with Grumpig, Spoink's evolution, no longer dependent on bouncing to survive. The evolution apparently includes the development of a functional, self-regulating circulatory system, freeing the Pokémon from the need for constant motion. This suggests that Spoink's bouncing-dependent heart is a juvenile characteristic, something that changes as the Pokémon matures and evolves. But it also means that every Spoink exists in a state of biological precariousness, one stumble or injury away from death, unable to rest properly until it evolves and its body develops the ability to maintain itself without external stimulus. The darkness implicit in Spoink's biology represents the kind of detail that Pokémon includes without fully acknowledging, presenting disturbing information in clinical Pokédex text, while the games themselves maintain their cheerful tone. Players who read the entries carefully encounter these moments of horror, these implications that the Pokémon world is far stranger and crueler than the surface narrative suggests. But younger players, or those who don't read Pokédex entries carefully, can engage with Spoink as simply a cute bouncing pig, never encountering the disturbing reality of its existence. This layering of information, where the games contain dark details that remain optional and easy to miss, allows Pokémon to serve different audiences simultaneously. Children can enjoy the surface experience, collecting and battling creatures that look appealing and have interesting abilities. Older players can dig deeper, finding the unsettling implications and biological impossibilities that make the Pokémon world feel more complex and strange. Spoink's heart-bouncing dependency exists for those who want to encounter it, adding depth and strangeness to the creature while remaining invisible to players who prefer not to think about such things. Drifloon presents itself as a whimsical balloon Pokémon, a ghost and flying type that resembles a child's toy, drifting on winds. But its Pokédex entries describe behavior that crosses from playful mischief into genuine horror, presenting Drifloon as a creature that abducts children and drags them to the afterlife. The Pokémon Sun entry states this explicitly, describing how Drifloon grabs the hands of small children and pulls them away, separating them from parents and guardians, carrying them toward death. The entry also notes, with disturbing specificity, that Drifloon dislikes heavy children, suggesting that it has attempted and failed to abduct children whose weight exceeds its carrying capacity. This detail about weight preference adds an unexpected layer of cruelty to Drifloon's behavior, implying not just that it kidnaps children, but that it discriminates based on physical characteristics, that some children are deemed unsuitable for abduction and left behind. The image of Drifloon attempting to lift a heavier child and failing, then floating away in frustration or embarrassment, is both darkly comic and deeply unsettling. It suggests a Pokémon with preferences and standards, one that makes choices about which children to target based on practical considerations rather than random chance. The question of what happens to children Drifloon successfully abducts remains unanswered by the games, which never show or describe the aftermath of these kidnappings. The Pokédex mentions the afterlife as their destination, suggesting that Drifloon's victims die or are transported to some realm of the dead. But the games never confirm this, never show a town mourning missing children or parents searching for kids who floated away with strange balloon Pokémon. The horror exists in the Pokédex text, but doesn't intrude into the actual gameplay or world, creating another instance where the game's written lore contradicts or extends far beyond what the player actually experiences. Drifloon's presence in the games feels innocent despite this dark lore, appearing as a rare encounter that players might seek out for collection purposes or to fill Pokédex entries. The creature's design is cute and unthreatening, a simple balloon shape with minimal features, nothing that would suggest danger or malice to someone unfamiliar with its Pokédex entries. This disconnect between appearance and described behavior is common in ghost-type Pokémon, where cute or whimsical designs often mask disturbing backstories or abilities. The games seem to enjoy this contradiction, using it to create moments of surprise when players discover that seemingly innocent Pokémon have dark secrets. The fact that Drifloon appears in areas frequented by children in the games, often near playgrounds or outside buildings where kids gather, adds another layer of discomfort to its presence. The Pokemon positions itself where it's most likely to encounter potential victims, displaying a predatory intelligence that goes beyond simple instinct. Parents in the Pokemon world would presumably warn their children about Drifloon, teaching them not to grab the strings of balloon Pokemon that drift by offering rides. But the games never show this kind of cultural adaptation, never depict a society that has learned to protect itself from a creature that specifically targets its most vulnerable members. Machoke's Pokédex entries and official handbook descriptions reveal personality traits that seem more appropriate for a reality show contestant than a fighting type Pokémon. The official handbook states that Machoke likes its body too much, that it spends excessive time admiring itself in mirrors rather than training or improving its abilities. This narcissism apparently reaches the point where nothing else matters to Machoke, where its self-absorption becomes its defining characteristic, overshadowing even its impressive physical strength and fighting capabilities. This personality profile creates an interesting contrast with Machoke's position in the evolutionary line, a middle stage between the eager Machop and the powerful Machamp. Machop is described as training constantly, working to build strength and skill, while Machamp has achieved a level of power that requires special clothing to contain it. Machoke sits between these stages, strong enough to be vain about its physique, but not yet powerful enough to transcend vanity and focus on higher goals. The narcissism becomes a character flaw that Machoke must overcome to evolve, a mental barrier that prevents progression until the Pokemon can move beyond self-admiration and commit to genuine growth. The image of Machoke flexing in front of mirrors, too distracted by its own reflection to train properly, has a comedic quality that sets it apart from most Pokemon personality descriptions. The series usually avoids assigning such specific character flaws to its creatures, preferring to describe behavior patterns or general temperaments rather than individual psychological issues. Machoke's handbook entry breaks this pattern, presenting a Pokemon with a personality problem that would be recognized as such even in human contexts, vanity that has crossed into dysfunction. This characterization also raises questions about how Machoke interacts with trainers, whether its narcissism affects its willingness to follow commands or participate in battles. A Pokemon that cares more about maintaining its appearance than winning fights would be a liability in competitive contexts. A partner that might refuse to engage in battles that could damage its physique or require excessive exertion. The games never explore this possibility, treating Machoke like any other Pokemon in terms of battle mechanics and trainer obedience. But the existence of the handbook entry suggests that at some point, someone at Game Freak or the Pokemon Company thought carefully about Machoke's psychology and decided that vanity was its central characteristic. The evolution from vain Machoke to powerful Machamp implies a transformation not just in strength, but in mindset, a maturation that allows the Pokemon to move past superficial concerns and embrace its true potential. Machamp's additional arms and increased bulk make it less conventionally attractive than Machoke's more humanoid proportions, suggesting that evolution requires accepting a less aesthetically pleasing form in exchange for greater power. The trade-off from beautiful but vain to powerful but less conventionally attractive becomes a narrative about growing up, about learning that strength and capability matter more than appearance, that true achievement requires setting aside narcissism and committing to development that might not always be comfortable or flattering. The technical constraints that defined early Pokemon games created design solutions that became part of the series' identity, choices made from necessity that players accepted as intentional creative decisions. The limited color palette of the original Game Boy meant that each Pokemon could only use a few shades, forcing designers to create creatures that worked in near monochrome before color versions were even considered. This constraint actually benefited the designs, requiring simplicity and clarity that made each Pokemon instantly recognizable even in the tiny sprites that appeared on screen. The transition to Game Boy Color brought new challenges, requiring designers to assign colors to creatures that had previously existed in shades of gray. Some Pokemon's colors seem obvious in retrospect, but others required careful consideration. Decisions about whether to make Pokemon realistic colors based on the animals they resembled, or more fantastical colors that would make them visually distinctive. The choices made during this transition established color schemes that have remained consistent across subsequent games, even as graphics technology allowed for more nuanced shading and detail. Sprite work for battles presented particular challenges, as each Pokemon needed both a front sprite, shown when the opponent's Pokemon appeared, and a back sprite, shown when your own Pokemon was sent out. These sprites had to be recognizable from both angles while working within severe size and color limitations. Early games sometimes struggled with back sprites, creating versions of Pokemon that barely resembled their front-facing counterparts, that looked distorted or poorly proportioned. Players accepted these quirks as part of the Game Boy experience, not expecting perfect consistency from hardware that could only display simple graphics. The evolution of Pokemon graphics across generations tracks closely with advances in handheld gaming technology, each new system allowing for more detailed sprites, more fluid animations, and more sophisticated color use. The jump from Game Boy Color to Game Boy Advance brought animated sprites that moved during battle, adding personality and life to creatures that had previously been static images. The Nintendo DS introduced 3D models alongside sprites, beginning a transition that would eventually lead to fully 3D Pokemon in later generations. Each advance brought new creative possibilities, while also creating nostalgia for the simpler graphics of earlier games. The decision to move fully to 3D models in the 3DS era represented a fundamental shift in how Pokemon were designed and presented, requiring creatures to work from multiple angles simultaneously, to have fully realized three-dimensional forms rather than just two carefully crafted sprite views. Some Pokemon translated well to 3D, their designs naturally suited to three-dimensional space. Others struggled, looking awkward or losing the appeal they had in sprite form, revealing that their designs had been optimized for two-dimensional presentation and didn't necessarily work when fully realized. The community response to these changes varied, with some players embracing the new visual style, while others mourned the loss of pixel art and the specific aesthetic that sprites provided. The preservation of sprite-based games in the collective memory of the Pokémon community ensures that the technical constraints and creative solutions of early generations remain visible and appreciated. Players continue to return to red and blue, gold and silver, even ruby and sapphire, finding value in their limited graphics and simpler presentations. The constraints that shaped these games' visual identities weren't just technical limitations to be overcome, but creative frameworks that produce distinctive as memorable results. Modern Pokemon games have more freedom, more technological capability, but they've also lost something of the necessity-driven creativity that made early games visually coherent, despite their limitations. The darkness woven through Pokemon's world reveals itself in Pokédex entries that describe predation, death, and violence in clinical language that seems at odds with the game's cheerful presentations. Entries mention Pokémon that hunt other Pokémon, that kill for food or territory, that engage in behaviors that would horrify players if shown directly in gameplay. Mandibuzz is described as making nests from the bones of its prey, decorating them with skulls as warnings to other creatures. Phantump is said to be the ghost of a child who died lost in the forest, its existence a permanent reminder of tragedy and death. These entries create a version of the Pokémon world that exists in text but not in gameplay, a setting where death and violence are common but never depicted, where the Pokédex describes realities that the player never witnesses. The disconnect allows younger players to engage with the games without encountering disturbing content, while older players who read entries carefully discover a darker, more complex world than the surface presentation suggests. The games maintain this duality throughout, never resolving the tension between what they describe and what they show. Some Pokemon's entries describe behaviors so disturbing that they seem to belong in a different franchise entirely, in games that embrace horror rather than friendship and adventure. Gorobus is said to drain the body fluids of its prey, leaving behind dried husks. Beware hugs its trainers with such force that it can break their spines, killing through affection rather than malice. These details add depth and strangeness to the Pokemon world, suggesting that not all creatures are safe or friendly, that even Pokemon that look cute or harmless might pose genuine dangers. The inclusion of these dark entries alongside more innocent ones creates a Pokédex that feels comprehensive and realistic, acknowledging that an ecosystem containing hundreds of species would naturally include predators, parasites, and creatures with disturbing adaptations. The games present this information without judgment, treating it as natural history rather than horror, maintaining the same clinical tone for entries about friendly Pokemon and entries about creatures that kill children or drain bodily fluids. This neutral presentation allows players to decide how seriously to take these descriptions, whether to view them as genuine lore or as exaggerations and legends that exist within the game world, but might not be literally true. The persistence of these dark entries across generations suggests that the developers view them as important to the series' identity, as part of what makes Pokémon feel like a real world rather than a sanitized fantasy. Real ecosystems include death and predation, creatures that survive by consuming others, species whose behaviors seem cruel or disturbing from human perspectives. By including Pokédex entries that acknowledge these realities, the games ground themselves in a version of naturalism that coexists with their fantastical elements, creating a world that feels both magical and grounded, wonderful and occasionally terrible. The evolution of Pokémon designs across generations reveals shifting priorities and changing aesthetic sensibilities, with each new generation reflecting both the creative vision of its designers and the cultural moment in which it was created. Generation 1's designs were often simple and directly inspired by real animals, with Pokemon like Rattata and Pidgey serving as straightforward fantasy versions of rats and pigeons. These creatures established the series' approach to creature design, taking familiar animals and adding distinctive features that made them recognizably Pokemon while maintaining clear connections to their real-world inspirations. Later generations moved away from this direct animal inspiration, embracing more abstract concepts and complex design elements. Generation 3 introduced Pokemon based on weather phenomena, ancient civilizations, and cosmic concepts, creatures like Castform and the Reggie trio that represented ideas rather than simply fantastical versions of known animals. This shift allowed for more creative freedom, but also created designs that sometimes felt less grounded, less connected to the natural world that early Pokemon had inhabited so comfortably. The tension between simple, animal-based designs and more complex, concept-based ones has defined much of the community discourse around new Pokemon, with some players preferring the straightforward approach of early generations, while others appreciate the creativity and ambition of later designs. Neither approach is objectively better, and the series has generally tried to maintain a balance, including both types of Pokemon in each new generation. Some creatures remain close to their animal inspirations, while others push into more abstract territory, exploring design possibilities that couldn't exist in earlier, more constrained contexts. The increasing complexity of Pokemon designs over time also reflects advances in graphics technology and players' growing familiarity with the series' visual language. Early games needed simple designs that would read clearly on the Game Boy's limited screen, creatures that could be recognized from their small sprites. Modern games can handle more detail and complexity, allowing for designs that include multiple colors, intricate patterns, and subtle features that would have been invisible or confusing in earlier hardware. This technical freedom has enabled more ambitious designs, but has also sometimes resulted in creatures that feel over-designed, that include too many elements so competing for attention. The ongoing evolution of Pokemon design philosophy suggests that the series will continue to explore new aesthetic directions while maintaining enough connection to its roots to feel coherent and recognizable. Each generation introduces designs that push boundaries and test what a Pokemon can be, while also including creatures that feel classic and familiar, that could have appeared in earlier games without seeming out of place. This balance between innovation and tradition keeps the series feeling fresh while preserving the core identity that made it successful, allowing Pokemon to evolve without losing sight of what made it special in the first place. As we drift toward the end of this journey through facts that hide in margins and footnotes, it's worth acknowledging how much remains unknown or uncertain about Pokemon's development, how many decisions were made without documentation, how many details exist only in the memories of designers who may never share them publicly. The facts we can confirm, the details that surface in interviews or data mines or official guidebooks, represent only a fraction of the creative work that went into building this franchise, only the most visible outcomes of processes that involved countless small choices and compromises. The willingness of fans to dig through code, to analyze sprite sheets and sound files, to compile developer interviews and piece together timelines of development, has preserved a knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. The Pokemon community's obsessive attention to detail has created an archive of information that extends far beyond what the games themselves present, a collective understanding of the series that draws from official sources, leaks, speculation, and careful observation. This community-driven knowledge base ensures that even obscure facts, like Diglett having feet or splash meaning hop rather than splash, become widely known and discussed. The facts that most players never encounter, that remain buried in Pokédex entries, or require reading official handbooks or watching specific episodes, add depth to the Pokémon world without demanding that everyone engage with them. The series allows for different levels of investment and knowledge, creating experiences that work whether you're a casual player who just wants to catch creatures and battle friends, or a dedicated fan who reads every piece of text and analyzes every design choice. The facts we've explored tonight exist for those who want to find them, adding richness and strangeness to a world that rewards curiosity and careful attention. The accumulation of these details over decades of games, shows, movies, and supplementary materials has created a fictional world with genuine depth, one that feels lived in and complex, despite being built entirely from creative decisions and programmed systems. The Pokemon world contains contradictions and mysteries, dark implications and whimsical absurdities, realistic biology and impossible physics. It works not because it's perfectly consistent, but because it's rich enough to accommodate multiple interpretations, to let different players find different meanings and connections in the same material. The ongoing production of new Pokemon content ensures that facts like these will continue to accumulate, that future players will discover new oddities and unexpected details that add to the collective knowledge of the series. Each new game introduces creatures with new Pokédex entries, new mechanics with unexpected implications, new characters who reveal information about how the Pokemon world functions. The archive of interesting facts grows with every release, creating more material for players to discover and discuss, more evidence of the creativity and thoughtfulness that goes into building this universe. The relationship between official canon and player interpretation remains fluid and negotiable, with fans often deciding which details to accept and which to ignore, which implications to take seriously, and which to dismiss as exaggerations or mistakes. This flexibility allows the Pokemon world to mean different things to different people, to support various readings and understandings without requiring everyone to agree on a single version of reality. The facts exist, documented and confirmable, but their significance remains open to debate and personal preference. The regional variants introduced in Generation 7 represented a significant shift in how Pokemon approach the concept of evolution and adaptation, acknowledging that the same species could develop differently depending on environmental pressures and geographical isolation. Alolan forms took familiar Pokemon from Kanto and reimagined them with different types, different colorations, different behaviors that reflected their adaptation to tropical island environments. The concept felt both scientifically grounded and creatively liberating, allowing designers to revisit classic Pokemon and explore what they might become under different circumstances. Alolan Executor became one of the most striking examples of this approach, transforming the short, squat palm tree Pokemon into a towering creature with an impossibly long neck that reached toward the sun. The design played with the idea that Executor in Kanto had been stunted, unable to reach its full potential in environments that didn't provide ideal growing conditions. In Alola's tropical climate, freed from constraints that limited its growth, Executor could stretch toward the sky, becoming the creature it was always meant to be. The transformation felt both absurd and oddly logical, a creative choice that respected biological principles while pushing them into fantastical territory. The decision to make Alolan Vulpix and Ninetales ice types rather than fire types represented an even more dramatic reimagining, taking creatures defined by their association with fire and flame and completely inverting their elemental nature. The explanation provided through Pokédex entries suggested that Vulpix had migrated to snowy mountain regions to avoid competition with other fire types, gradually adapting to cold environments until ice became their primary element. This narrative of adaptation and survival grounded the type change in evolutionary logic, making it feel like a natural consequence of environmental pressure rather than an arbitrary design choice. These regional variants opened creative possibilities that subsequent generations have continued to explore, with Galarian forms in Generation 8 and Hisuian forms in Legends Arceus expanding the concept to include different regions and time periods. Each new set of regional variants allows designers to revisit older Pokémon and explore alternative evolutionary paths, keeping classic creatures relevant while introducing fresh takes on familiar designs. The approach acknowledges that Pokémon are not static entities, but creatures capable of adaptation and change, subject to the same evolutionary pressures that shape real animals. The lore implications of regional variants extend beyond simple design variations, raising questions about how these different forms relate to each other, whether they can interbreed, whether they're truly the same species, or have diverged enough to be classified separately. The games generally avoid addressing these questions directly, allowing both forms to coexist without requiring detailed explanations of their relationship or evolutionary history. This ambiguity serves the gameplay experience, making regional variants feel special and distinctive without bogging down the narrative in biological minutiae that might limit creative freedom. The trading system that has defined Pokémon since its inception was born from necessity and creative vision in equal measure, a feature designed to encourage social interaction while also creating gameplay mechanics that couldn't exist in single-player contexts. The original Game Boy games had link cable functionality that allowed two systems to communicate, and Satoshi Tajiri envisioned using this feature to let players trade creatures, sharing discoveries, and helping each other complete their Pokédexes. The concept drew inspiration from his childhood hobby of collecting insects, the way children would trade beetles and compare collections, competing to find the rarest specimens. The decision to include version-exclusive Pokémon elevated trading from an optional feature to a necessary one for players who wanted to complete their Pokédex. Red version contained Pokémon that blue version didn't, and vice versa, creating forced scarcity that could only be resolved through interaction with other players. This design choice felt controversial to some players, particularly those without access to link cables or friends who owned the opposite version, but it succeeded in creating the social experience Tajiri had envisioned, transforming Pokémon from a solitary activity into a communal one. Certain Pokémon were designed specifically to take advantage of trading mechanics, creatures like Haunter and Machoke that could only evolve when traded to another player's game. This evolution method created Pokémon that required cooperation to obtain, that couldn't be acquired through solo play, no matter how much time or effort a player invested. The restriction felt arbitrary to players who preferred single-player experiences, but it reinforced the social aspects that defined Pokémon's vision, making certain creatures symbols of friendship and connection rather than just collectibles to be obtained through grinding. The trading system also created an economy where certain Pokémon became more valuable than others, where rare creatures or those with perfect stats could be bargained for and negotiated over. This emergent economy wasn't explicitly designed, but grew naturally from the trading mechanics, with players developing their own standards for what constituted a fair trade, what made certain Pokémon worth more than others. The community-driven nature of this economy allowed for flexibility and creativity, with different groups of players valuing different characteristics and creating local trading cultures that varied by region and social circle. Modern Pokémon games have expanded trading capabilities through online systems that connect players globally, removing geographic barriers that once limited who could trade with whom. The Wonder Trade feature introduced in Generation 6 took this even further, allowing players to trade Pokémon with random strangers anywhere in the world, creating moments of surprise and possibility that recaptured some of the magic of early local trading. These systems have transformed trading from a local, personal activity into a global phenomenon, connecting millions of players in a continuous network of exchange and collection. The mythology that underpins Pokemon's creation stories, the legends that explain how the universe itself came into being, grew more complex and ambitious with each generation. Generation 4 introduced Arceus, described as the original Pokemon, the creature that created all other Pokemon and shaped the universe itself. This cosmic origin story elevated Pokemon beyond simple fantasy creatures, suggesting a creation mythology that rivaled real-world religions in scope and ambition. Arceus stood above even legendary Pokemon like Mewtwo or Lugia, occupying a role more akin to a deity than an unusually powerful creature. The creation trio, Dialga, Palkia, and Giratina, served as Arceus's first creations, Pokemon that controlled time, space, and antimatter respectively. Each represented a fundamental aspect of reality, forces so powerful and abstract that they could barely be contained in physical form. The games treated these Pokemon with appropriate reverence, making them central to Generation 4's plot and presenting them as creatures whose powers exceeded anything players had encountered in previous games. The decision to make space and time themselves into Pokemon demonstrated how far the series had come from its origins in collecting creatures inspired by insects and animals. The Lake Guardians, Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf, represented another tier of this cosmic hierarchy, Pokemon that embodied knowledge, emotion, and willpower. These creatures served as a bridge between the godlike creation trio and the more accessible legendary Pokemon that players could actually catch and use in battle. The mythology suggested that these guardians helped teach early humans that they played crucial roles in the development of human consciousness and civilization. This narrative elevated Pokemon from creatures that existed alongside humans to beings that actively shaped human development and evolution. Later generations continued building on this mythological foundation, introducing Pokemon like Cernius and Yveltal that represented life and death, or Solgaleo and Lunala that embodied the sun and moon. Each new legendary pair added to the cosmology, creating a universe where fundamental forces and concepts took physical form as Pokemon. The accumulations of these mythological creatures transformed the series' lore from simple fantasy into something approaching genuine mythology, stories about the origin and nature of existence itself. The question of how these cosmic, godlike Pokemon relate to the more ordinary creatures that players catch on routes and in forests remains largely unexplored by the games. The gulf between Arceus, creator of the universe, and a Rattata hiding in tall grass is so vast that it seems strange they're classified as the same type of being. But the games maintain this continuity, treating all Pokemon as part of the same spectrum of existence, from the mundane to the divine. This inclusive approach allows the series to explore cosmic themes while maintaining the core experience of collecting and battling creatures, never letting the mythology overshadow the fundamental gameplay that defines Pokémon. The battle mechanics that players engage with constantly, the foundation of every trainer encounter and gym battle, hide surprising complexity beneath their accessible surface. Type advantages and resistances create a rock-paper-scissors structure that extends across 18 different types, each with its own set of strengths and weaknesses that players must learn and remember. This system provides strategic depth while remaining simple enough for children to grasp, a balance that has defined Pokemon's combat design since the beginning. But hidden within this system are quirks and exceptions that reveal the thought process behind type matchups, decisions that sometimes prioritize gameplay balance over logical consistency. The fact that bug-type moves are super effective against dark types, for example, draws from the Japanese cultural context, where bugs are associated with heroism and righteousness, creating a connection that Western players might not immediately understand. The decision to make psychic types weak to ghost and dark types came in response to Generation 1's balance issues, where psychic Pokémon dominated competitive play due to limited weaknesses. The addition of new types in later generations required rethinking the entire type chart, rebalancing relationships, and creating new matchups that would affect every existing Pokémon. Generation 2 introduced Steel and Dark types, fundamentally changing how battles worked and which Pokémon were viable in competitive contexts. The Steel type provided defensive options that hadn't previously existed, creating Pokémon that could wall opponents and stall battles through pure durability. The Dark type specifically countered Psychic Pokémon, addressing the balance problems that had plagued Generation 1 while introducing its own strategic considerations. Generation 6's addition of the Fairy type represented an even more dramatic intervention, introduced specifically to counter dragon types that had dominated competitive play for years. Dragons were immune to very few attacks and resisted many common types, making them default choices for serious battlers. Fairy Pokemon changed this calculus overnight, creating a type that was not only super effective against dragons, but completely immune to their dragon type attacks. The shift transformed the competitive metagame, forcing players to reconsider team compositions and strategies that had been viable for over a decade. The complexity of battle mechanics extends far beyond simple type matchups, encompassing stats, abilities, held items, weather effects, terrain effects, and countless other variables that can influence the outcome of a battle. Understanding all these systems and how they interact requires genuine study and practice, creating a skill ceiling that allows for competitive play at the highest levels while remaining accessible to casual players who only engage with the basic type advantages. This dual nature, simple on the surface but infinitely deep for those who choose to explore it, defines much of Pokemon's enduring appeal. The music that accompanies players through their journeys, the soundtracks that have defined each generation's emotional landscape, represents some of the most carefully crafted aspects of Pokemon's presentation. Junichi Masuda, who served as composer for many of the early games, understood that music could create atmosphere and emotional resonance in ways that the Game Boy's limited graphics couldn't match. The themes he composed for Red and Blue worked within severe technical constraints, using the Game Boy's simple sound chip to create melodies that have remained iconic decades later. The rival battle theme from Generation 1 established a musical template that would influence every subsequent generation, creating a sense of urgency and competition through its driving rhythm and aggressive melody. The theme communicated everything players needed to understand about their relationship with their rival, the friendly but serious competition that drove both characters to improve and grow. This musical characterization proved so effective that later games struggled to match it, with many players considering the original rival theme the definitive version despite numerous remakes and reimaginings. Lavender Town's theme became legendary for different reasons. Its eerie, unsettling melody creating an atmosphere of sadness and supernatural dread that felt unprecedented in a children's game. The theme accompanied players through a town built around a Pokemon cemetery where ghosts haunted a tower filled with mourners and memorials. The music made this area genuinely unsettling, using simple melodic choices and unusual chord progressions to create discomfort and unease. Urban legends grew around the theme, stories about frequencies that caused illness or disturbing effects on young players, myths that demonstrated the power of the music to unsettle and disturb even outside the game's context. Later generations benefited from improved sound hardware, allowing composers to create more complex and ambitious soundtracks that couldn't have been realized on the Game Boy. The orchestral arrangements in Generation 5, the environmental sounds woven into Generation 6's music, the dynamic themes in Generation 7 that changed based on battle conditions, all of these innovations demonstrated the evolution of Pokemon's audio design. But even with these technical advances, the fundamental principles established by early games remained constant, using music to reinforce emotional moments and create memorable atmospheres. The decision to release orchestral performances of Pokemon music, to treat these compositions as serious musical works worthy of concert halls and professional musicians, validated what fans had understood intuitively for years. Pokemon's music was not just functional game audio, but carefully crafted composition that could stand on its own outside its original context. The success of these concerts demonstrated the emotional resonance the music had achieved, the way these themes had become inseparable from players' memories of their journeys through various regions. The breeding mechanics introduced in Generation 2 opened entirely new approaches to team building and Pokemon collection, allowing players to pass down moves, abilities, and stats from parent to offspring. This system created possibilities for customization and optimization that hadn't existed in Generation 1, where every Pokemon of a species was essentially identical aside from random stat variations. Breeding allowed dedicated players to craft perfect Pokemon with specific move combinations and maximum stats, investing hours or even days into producing creatures with ideal characteristics. The discovery of individual values and effort values, hidden stats that affected Pokemon's actual battle performance, transformed breeding from a casual feature into a serious competitive tool. These hidden values weren't explained anywhere in the games, requiring players to conduct research, perform calculations, and share information through community channels. The complexity of the system created a divide between casual players who might breed Pokemon occasionally for fun and competitive players who understood the mathematics of optimization and invested serious time into producing battle-ready teams. Egg moves, attacks that Pokemon could only learn through breeding rather than leveling up or TMs, added another layer of depth to the system. Some egg moves required complex breeding chains, passing the desired move through multiple species before finally arriving at the target Pokemon. These chains demanded planning and patience, requiring players to consult breeding guides and carefully execute multi-step processes to achieve their goals. The complexity felt daunting to newcomers, but provided engaging challenges for players who enjoyed optimization and long-term projects. Through introduction of hidden abilities through the dream world, and later through special encounters, created yet another variable for breeders to consider, abilities that could only be obtained through specific methods and then passed down through breeding. Some hidden abilities were dramatically better than standard ones, transforming previously unviable Pokemon into competitive threats. The scarcity of these abilities and the effort required to obtain and breed them created new forms of value and status within the community, with players trading for Pokemon with hidden abilities and specific breeding characteristics. Modern games have streamlined some aspects of breeding, introducing items and features that make producing competitive Pokemon less time-consuming. The Destiny Knot allows more stats to pass from parents to offspring, and bottle caps can maximize stats after a Pokemon is raised, removing some of the randomness that made breeding frustrating. These quality-of-life improvements have made competitive breeding more accessible while maintaining enough depth to reward players who invest time in understanding the systems and planning their breeding projects carefully. The decision to include real-world locations as inspiration for Pokemon regions created opportunities for cultural exchange and geographical education that enhanced the series beyond its gameplay. Kanto drew from the real Japanese region of the same name, incorporating landmarks and geographical features that Japanese players would recognize while introducing international audiences to Japanese geography and culture. This approach grounded the fantasy world in reality, making regions feel like places that could exist rather than purely imaginary constructs. Johto continued this pattern, drawing from the Kansai region of Japan and incorporating traditional architecture, historical sites, and cultural references that reflected Japanese heritage. The Ekrutake city's traditional buildings and the bell tower's mythology drew directly from real locations and legends, creating a region that felt deeply connected to Japanese culture and history. These cultural elements added depth and authenticity to the world, while introducing players to aspects of Japanese tradition they might not otherwise encounter. The shift to international regions, beginning with Unova in Generation 5, marked a significant change in approach, acknowledging Pokemon's global audience by setting games in regions inspired by locations outside Japan. Unova drew from New York City and the broader American Northeast, creating the series' first explicitly Western setting. The change felt both natural and slightly jarring, expanding Pokemon's world while also creating distance from the Japanese cultural context that had defined earlier games. Kalos, inspired by France, brought European architecture and culture into Pokemon's world, creating a region centered around a city clearly modeled on Paris. The emphasis on beauty, fashion, and culinary culture reflected French stereotypes and cultural exports in ways both affectionate and slightly superficial. Galar, based on Great Britain, incorporated industrial heritage, Celtic mythology, and British cultural touchstones, creating a region that felt distinctly British while translating those elements into Pokemon's fantasy context. The use of real world locations as templates created opportunities for players to feel represented and recognized, to see aspects of their own cultures and geographies reflected in Pokemon's world. But it also created risks of stereotyping and oversimplification, reducing complex cultures to a few easily recognizable elements that might not capture the full reality of the places being referenced. The balance between respectful representation and entertaining fantasy remains an ongoing challenge as the series continues exploring international settings. The Pokeathlon introduced in Heart Gold and Soul Silver represented an attempt to create gameplay that went beyond battles, offering activities where Pokemon's individual characteristics mattered in different ways. The competitions tested speed, power, skill, stamina, and jump ability through various minigames that required different approaches and strategies. This diversification acknowledged that Pokemon could excel in areas beyond combat, that a creature's value wasn't solely determined by its battle capabilities. The feature never quite achieved the popularity of Pokemon contests, which had introduced similar ideas in Generation 3, perhaps because the minigames felt less polished or because the rewards weren't compelling enough to justify the time investment. But the concept itself represented important thinking about what Pokemon could be beyond battle machines, exploring the idea that these creatures had personalities and capabilities that extended into other areas of competition and performance. Pokemon Amy and its successor, Pokemon Refresh, introduced in Generations 6 and 7, provided non-competitive interactions with Pokemon, allowing players to feed, pet, and play with their creatures in ways that built affection and provided small gameplay bonuses. These features emphasized the relationship between trainer and Pokemon, creating mechanical incentives for activities that had previously been purely aesthetic or role-playing choices. The ability to pet Pokemon, to see them react to touch and attention, added a layer of tactile intimacy that deepened the emotional bond players felt with their teams. The camping feature in Sword and Shield expanded these interaction possibilities, allowing players to set up camp anywhere and engage with their entire parties simultaneously. Watching Pokemon interact with each other, play together, and respond to the player's attention created emergent moments of charm and personality that couldn't be scripted. These interactions made Pokemon feel more alive, more like companions with their own behaviors and preferences, rather than just statistics and movesets stored in a device. These non-battle features recognize that many players engage with Pokemon for reasons beyond competitive battling, that the series' appeal includes emotional connection, collection, and the simple pleasure of spending time with creatures they've grown attached to. By providing gameplay systems that support and encourage these non-competitive engagements, recent games have validated these playstyles and created space for players who might not be interested in EV training or competitive team building, but still want deep, meaningful experiences with their Pokemon. The mystery gifts and event distributions that have characterized Pokemon's post-launch support created ongoing reasons to engage with games long after completing the main story. These limited-time distributions offered Pokemon with special moves, unique abilities, or rare characteristics that couldn't be obtained through normal gameplay. The exclusivity created urgency and encouraged regular check-ins, transforming games from products that could be completed and set aside into ongoing services that rewarded continued engagement. Some event, Pokemon became genuinely rare and valuable within player communities, creatures that could only be obtained during specific windows and never again through normal means. The scarcity created secondary markets where players would trade multiple regular Pokemon for a single event exclusive, establishing value hierarchies that the games themselves never explicitly acknowledged. This economy operated outside official channels, driven entirely by player consensus about what made certain Pokemon worth more than others. The decision to make some mythical Pokemon available only through these distributions meant that completing the Pokédex required more than just playing the games thoroughly. Players needed to attend events, monitor distribution announcements, ensure they obtained creatures during narrow availability windows. This approach frustrated completionists who couldn't access events due to geographical or temporal limitations, creating a form of artificial scarcity that seemed designed more for marketing purposes than gameplay reasons. Modern distribution methods through internet connectivity have democratized access to event Pokemon, allowing players anywhere in the world to receive distributions without attending physical events or purchasing movie tickets. This shift has made completion more achievable while reducing the sense of exclusivity that made certain Pokemon feel special. The balance between accessibility and exclusivity remains difficult to achieve, with different players preferring different approaches depending on their priorities and circumstances. The controversy surrounding Dexit, the decision to limit which Pokemon could be transferred to Sword and Shield, revealed how deeply players felt about their collections and the continuity of their teams across generations. For many, Pokemon weren't just data in a game, but companions they had raised and carried through multiple adventures, sometimes for well over a decade. The announcement that not all Pokemon would be transferable to the new games felt like betrayal, like breaking a fundamental promise that the series had made about preservation and continuity. The technical and design reasons for this decision made sense from a development perspective, with the increasing number of Pokemon making it unsustainable to animate and balance every creature for each new game. But these practical considerations felt insufficient to players who viewed their collections as investments of time and emotional energy, who had built teams and raised favorites with the understanding that they could bring them forward indefinitely. The decision forced a confrontation with the reality that games cannot preserve everything forever, that practical limitations eventually require compromises. The subsequent announcement that future games would rotate which Pokemon were available, allowing different creatures in different titles, attempted to address concerns while maintaining the new approach to roster limitations. This compromise satisfied some players while disappointing others who wanted guarantees that their favorites would appear in specific games. The ongoing debate reflects fundamental tensions about what Pokemon owes to long term fans versus what is practically achievable within development constraints. The implementation of Pokemon Home as a cloud storage service provided a solution to some of these concerns, allowing players to store their collections in a service that would persist across games, even if specific titles couldn't include all creatures. This approach separated collection from active gameplay, acknowledging that some players valued having complete collections even if they couldn't actually use every Pokemon in battle. The service transformed the traditional box storage system into something more permanent and cross generational, though it required ongoing subscription fees that monetized what had previously been a free feature. The Pokemon used by important characters throughout the series often reflect their personalities and roles in ways that go beyond simple type preferences. Gym leaders specialize in specific types, creating predictable but thematically coherent teams that test particular aspects of battle strategy. Elite Four members typically use more diverse teams while maintaining thematic connections, whether through color schemes, evolutionary families, or conceptual links that define their approach to training. The player's rivals have evolved significantly across generations, shifting from the aggressive competitiveness of Blue in Generation 1 to the supportive friendship of characters like Hop in Sword and Shield. These personality changes reflect shifting attitudes about competition and what it means to be a trainer, moving away from the idea that rivals must be antagonistic toward a more collaborative model where friendly competition drives improvement without creating hostility. The change has proven controversial among players who preferred the sharper edge of early rivals, who felt that later games softened the rivalry concept too much. Champions represent the pinnacle of each region's competitive scene, final obstacles that test everything players have learned throughout their journey. The teams these champions use often become the most memorable battles in their respective games, encounters that require careful strategy and well-built teams to overcome. Lance's team of dragon types in Generation 1, Cynthia's diverse and carefully optimized team in Generation 4, and Leon's versatile roster in Generation 8 all created challenges that forced players to adapt and strategize beyond simple type advantages. The evil teams that serve as recurring antagonists have grown more complex and ambiguous over time, moving from simple criminal organizations like Team Rocket toward groups with philosophical motivations like Team Plasma or well-intentioned extremists like Team Flare. This evolution reflects more sophisticated storytelling, acknowledging that antagonists can believe they're helping the world even while causing harm. The shift from pure villainy toward moral complexity created more interesting narratives, but also sometimes undercut the satisfaction of defeating these teams, as their goals were often sympathetic, even if their methods were wrong. The inclusion of villains who are genuinely convinced they're right, like Lysandra's belief that reducing the population would preserve beauty and resources, forces players to engage with difficult questions about sacrifice and utilitarianism. These narratives rarely have time to explore their ethical implications fully, constrained by the game's formats and target audiences, but they plant seeds that older players can consider and discuss. The fact that children's games include these morally complex scenarios demonstrates trust in young players' ability to think critically about difficult topics. The nature of shiny Pokemon, alternate colorations that appear rarely and randomly, created a form of status and achievement that operated outside the game's official progression systems. Finding a shiny required patience, luck, or dedicated hunting methods that could consume hundreds of hours for a single rare encounter. The rarity made shinies valuable in ways that had nothing to do with battle utility, creating a collector's economy where color variation mattered more than stats or moves. The Masuda method, named after composer and director Junichi Masuda, provided a systematic approach to increasing shiny encounter rates through breeding Pokemon from different language games. This technique acknowledged the global player base and created incentives for international trading as players sought foreign Pokemon to improve their shiny breeding odds. The community that formed around shiny hunting developed specialized knowledge and techniques, sharing strategies and celebrating successful hunts with an enthusiasm that seemed disproportionate to the actual gameplay benefit of finding differently colored creatures. Soft resetting for shiny legendary Pokemon became a particular form of endurance challenge, with players saving before encounters and then repeatedly resetting their games until the desired shiny finally appeared. This process could take days, weeks, or even months of continuous effort, testing dedication and patience in ways that had nothing to do with skill or strategy. The commitment required elevated shiny hunting from casual interest to serious hobby, creating a sub-community within the larger Pokemon fanbase dedicated to pursuing these rare variations. The introduction of the shiny charm in later generations, an item that increased shiny encounter rates after completing the Pokédex, rewarded completionists while acknowledging that the base shiny rate was frustratingly low for players who wanted to hunt deliberately. This quality of life improvement made shiny hunting more accessible without eliminating the rarity that made these encounters special. The balance between accessibility and exclusivity defined much of the community's relationship with shinies, with different players preferring different approaches depending on their patience and priorities. The evolution of player character customization across generations reflected increasing attention to representation and self expression. Early games offered no customization at all, with players represented by predetermined sprites that couldn't be modified. The introduction of gender selection in Crystal marked the first step toward allowing players to see themselves in their characters, though options remained extremely limited. The full customization systems, introduced in Generation 6, allowed players to change hairstyles, clothing, and accessories, creating opportunities for self expression that enhanced immersion and personal connection. The inclusion of more diverse skin tone options acknowledged the series' global audience and the desire for players of all backgrounds to create characters that resembled them. This seemingly simple addition carried significant meaning for players who had never been able to create characters that looked like them in earlier games. The representation mattered not because it changed gameplay, but because it signaled recognition and inclusion, acknowledging that Pokemon players came from all backgrounds and deserved to see themselves in these worlds. The fashion systems that accompanied character customization created entire gameplay loops around collecting clothing and accessories, visiting boutiques, and changing outfits for different occasions. For some players, these systems became central to their enjoyment of the games, offering ongoing goals and rewards that had nothing to do with battling or collecting Pokemon. The existence of these systems validated playstyles focused on aesthetics and self expression, confirming that Pokemon could accommodate diverse interests and priorities. The photography features introduced in various forms across generations allowed players to capture and share moments from their journeys, creating personal documentation of their adventures. The ability to take pictures of Pokemon in their environments to freeze moments of battle or interaction transformed passive gameplay into active curation. Players could build portfolios of their favorite moments, sharing images that told stories about their experiences and relationships with specific Pokemon. As the evening deepens and details fade into comfortable darkness, the accumulated facts about Pokemon begin to feel less like isolated trivia and more like pieces of a larger understanding, fragments that collectively reveal the depth and complexity of this series that has endured for decades. Each generation has added layers, introduced new mechanics and creatures and stories, building on what came before while pushing in new directions. The result is a franchise vast enough to accommodate countless different playstyles and priorities, where competitive battlers and casual collectors and narrative enthusiasts can all find meaningful engagement. The facts we've explored tonight, from the technical details of sprite creation to the dark implications of Pokédex entries, from the business decisions that nearly ended the series to the design choices that defined its aesthetic identity, all contribute to this larger picture. They reveal a franchise built by creative teams willing to take risks, to experiment with unusual ideas, to include details that most players might never notice. The depth exists for those who seek it, adding richness to experiences that work perfectly well without ever engaging with this hidden complexity. The preservation of these facts through community effort, through data mining and interview archives, and careful observation ensures that knowledge about Pokemon's development and history remains accessible even as the games and systems that created them become obsolete. This collective documentation represents a form of care and investment that goes beyond simple fandom, approaching genuine preservation of cultural history. The Pokemon community's attention to detail and willingness to share knowledge has created an archive that will outlast any individual game or generation. The ongoing production of new games and content means that this archive will continue growing, that future players will discover new oddities and unexpected details to add to the collective understanding. Each new game introduces creatures with new Pokédex entries, new mechanics with unexpected implications, new design choices that reveal the thought processes and priorities of their creators. The facts will accumulate indefinitely, creating an ever-expanding body of knowledge that enriches appreciation of the series while revealing the countless decisions and compromises that shaped its evolution. The relationship between players and developers, mediated through these games and the communities that form around them, creates a unique form of conversation where feedback and criticism influence future directions, while past decisions remain preserved in the games themselves. Players who engage deeply with Pokemon, who notice its quirks and study its systems, contribute to this conversation whether or not they interact directly with developers. The attention itself matters, the willingness to look carefully and think critically about how these games work and what they communicate. The environmental storytelling present throughout Pokemon games often goes unnoticed by players focused on battling and progression, but careful attention reveals narratives told through building placement, NPC dialogue patterns, and environmental details that never receive explicit explanation. The Burned Tower in Johto tells a story of tragedy and legendary Pokemon through its architecture and the creatures found within, never requiring direct exposition to communicate what happened. Players who explore thoroughly and read between the lines discover histories that enrich the world without demanding attention. The placement of certain Pokemon in specific locations often reflects ecological thinking that goes beyond simple game design convenience. Water types appear near water sources, rock types inhabit caves and mountains, but more subtle patterns emerge when examining which specific species appear where. The games create implied food chains and territorial relationships through spawn patterns, suggesting that Pidgey avoid areas where Spearow are common, that certain Pokemon only appear in locations where their preferred prey also lives. These ecological details remain mostly invisible, but create coherent ecosystems for players who notice them. The ruins scattered across various regions hint at civilizations that existed before the events of the games, cultures that built temples and monuments that now lie abandoned or repurposed. The ruins of Alph in Johto, the Sky Pillar in Hoenn, the Abyssal Ruins in Univap all suggest histories that the games never fully explain, leaving players to piece together fragments of information from scattered texts and environmental clues. This approach to world building trusts players to engage with ambiguity, to accept that not everything will be explained or resolved. The weather systems introduced in Generation 3 added atmospheric variety while also creating mechanical complexity that affected battle strategies and exploration. Rain boosted water type moves while weakening fire type attacks, creating situations where battles played out differently depending on environmental conditions. The implementation felt natural, connecting weather to gameplay in ways that made the world feel more dynamic and responsive. Later generations expanded these systems with terrain effects and other environmental modifiers that added layers of strategic consideration. The time systems that began in Generation 2 and have appeared in various forms since create worlds that change based on when players engage with them, rewarding those who play at different times and creating events that can only be witnessed during specific windows. Certain Pokemon appear only at night. Shops have different inventories depending on the day. NPCs move through schedules that make them unavailable at certain hours. These systems make the game worlds feel lived in, suggesting that life continues even when the player isn't present, that these regions exist beyond the player's direct observation. The decision to include day and night cycles created complications for players who could only engage with games during limited windows, potentially locking them out of content that appeared during times they couldn't play. Later games addressed this through various systems that allowed players to manipulate time or access content regardless of real-world hours, acknowledging that game design shouldn't punish players for when they're able to play. The balance between simulation and accessibility remains an ongoing challenge for systems that tie gameplay to real-world time. The Battle Tower and subsequent Battle Frontier facilities introduced in Generation 3 created endgame content focused purely on competitive battling, offering challenges that tested team building and strategic thinking in ways the main story rarely demanded. These facilities removed the narrative framing of gym challenges and evil team conflicts, presenting pure competition where only skill and preparation mattered. The facilities attracted dedicated players who enjoyed optimization and strategy, creating communities focused on achieving win streaks and earning battle points. The rule variations across different Battle Frontier facilities forced players to adapt strategies and consider Pokemon they might never have used otherwise. The Battle Factory randomly assigned teams, removing the ability to rely on carefully bred and trained favorites. The Battle Pike introduced luck-based challenges, where strategic thinking mattered less than probability and risk assessment. These variations demonstrated different ways to engage with Pokemon battles, expanding the definition of skill beyond simple type matchups and statistical optimization. The rewards offered by Battle Frontier facilities included moves, items, and Pokemon that couldn't be obtained anywhere else in the games, creating incentives for players who might not otherwise engage with competitive content. The exclusive nature of these rewards frustrated some players while motivating others, creating divides between those who enjoyed the challenge and those who felt the content was too difficult or time-consuming for the rewards offered. The facilities represented an acknowledgement that hardcore players needed content scaled to their skill levels, even if that content remained inaccessible to more casual audiences. The removal or simplification of Battle Frontier content in later remakes sparked controversy among fans who valued these facilities and felt their removal represented dumbing down or casualization of the series. The debates revealed tensions between accessibility and depth, between creating games that welcomed new players and maintaining features that rewarded dedicated engagement. The compromise in recent games has involved creating simpler competitive facilities that offer challenges without the complexity of the original Battle Frontier, though these simplified versions rarely satisfy players who love the original implementations. The Pokerus, a beneficial virus that doubled the rate at which Pokemon gained effort values, existed as one of the rarest random occurrences in the entire series, rarer even than encountering shiny Pokemon. The virus spread between party members and eventually became dormant, creating time pressure to infect as many Pokemon as possible before losing the ability to transmit it. The mechanics remained poorly explained within the games, requiring players to consult external resources to understand what had happened when their Pokemon contracted this mysterious condition. The terminology itself, referring to a virus that benefited infected Pokemon rather than harming them, created confusion among players unfamiliar with beneficial microorganisms. The games presented Pokerus as universally positive, something to preserve and spread deliberately, inverting typical associations between viruses and illness. This scientific accuracy, acknowledging that not all viruses harm their hosts, added a layer of realism to the series' approach to biology, even as other elements remained firmly fantastical. The rarity of Pokerus made it valuable within trading communities, with infected Pokemon sometimes worth more than shinies or competitive-ready teams. Players who had never encountered Pokerus naturally might go years without seeing it, making the virus a genuine trophy that signaled either incredible luck or connection to communities that cultivated and shared infected Pokemon. The trading of Pokerus transformed an individual random event into a communal resource, with generous players intentionally spreading the virus through trading networks. The mechanic created interesting situations where Pokerus's effect became dormant, but the indicator remained, allowing Pokemon to keep the visual marker of having had the virus even after losing its mechanical benefits. These cured Pokemon couldn't spread the virus, but retained evidence of their infection, creating a permanent record that served no gameplay purpose, but held meaning for collectors and players who valued rare occurrences. The meaningless persistence of this marker exemplified Pokemon's willingness to include details that served narrative or emotional purposes, rather than pure gameplay utility. The move tutors scattered throughout various regions offered access to moves that couldn't be learned through normal leveling or TMs, creating another form of specialized knowledge and resource management. Some move tutors required payment in currency or collectible shards, creating economic decisions about which Pokemon deserved these exclusive moves. Others appeared only in post-game areas or required completion of specific challenges, gating powerful moves behind skill checks or exploration requirements. The existence of moves that could only be obtained through tutors and couldn't be passed down through breeding created interesting situations where Pokemon from older generations had access to moves that newer Pokemon of the same species couldn't learn. These move compatibility changes across generations reflected evolving ideas about balance and design, with problematic move combinations being restricted or removed in later games. The resulting legacy movesets became valuable, Pokemon from older games that retained access to move combinations no longer possible to create. The strategic implications of certain move tutor combinations elevated otherwise mediocre Pokemon into competitive viability, demonstrating how access to specific moves could transform a creature's utility and role. Communities dedicated to competitive battling maintained detailed records of which Pokemon could learn which tutor moves in which games, creating comprehensive databases that helped players plan their team building across multiple game versions and generations. This institutional knowledge became essential for serious competitive play, requiring engagement with resources beyond the games themselves. The decision to change which moves were available from tutors in different games created situations where obtaining specific move combinations required transferring Pokemon between games, sometimes across multiple generations. A player wanting a Pokemon with a particular move might need to teach it in one game, transfer it forward through several generations, then continue training in the newest version. This cross generational planning added complexity that some players enjoyed while others found frustrating, creating barriers to entry for competitive play that seemed unnecessarily complicated. The held items introduced in Generation 2 transformed battles by adding another layer of strategy and customization, allowing items to boost stats, alter type matchups, or trigger special effects during combat. The system started simply with berries that healed status conditions and items that boosted specific stats, but expanded dramatically in later generations to include complex items with multiple effects or strict activation requirements. The variety created endless team building possibilities while also making competitive play more difficult for newcomers to master. Some held items became so central to competitive play that certain Pokemon were rarely used without them, their viability tied directly to specific item combinations. Chansey became significantly more durable with a Violite, an item that boosted defensive stats of unevolved Pokemon. Choice items that locked Pokemon into single moves while dramatically increasing their power defined entire strategies built around predicting switches and maintaining offensive pressure. The items didn't just enhance Pokemon, but fundamentally altered how they should be played, creating item dependent strategies that failed completely if the item was removed or negated. The introduction of Mega Evolution in Generation 6 represented a dramatic expansion of held item mechanics, requiring Pokemon to hold specific Megastones to access temporary powered up forms during battle. These transformations changed stats, types, and sometimes abilities, creating versions of familiar Pokemon that played completely differently from their base forms. The system added spectacle and power fantasy while also creating balance concerns, as some Mega Evolutions were dramatically stronger than others, warping competitive play around a small number of dominant choices. The decision to remove Mega Evolution in Generation 8 while introducing Dynamax demonstrated a willingness to abandon even successful mechanics in favor of new ideas, though this choice frustrated players who had invested in building teams around specific Mega Evolutions. The replacement system felt less personal, applying to all Pokemon equally, rather than requiring specific items and planning. The shift reflected changing design philosophies about temporary power ups and whether they should be broadly accessible or restricted to specific Pokemon with unique forms. The fossils that appear throughout various regions as items that can be revived into ancient Pokemon create interesting questions about these creatures' biology and history. The games present fossil Pokemon as extinct species that once inhabited these regions, now available only through scientific resurrection. But the rock typing assigned to all fossil Pokemon raises questions about whether this typing is authentic to their prehistoric forms or an artifact of the fossilization and revival process, whether these creatures were originally rock types or if the resurrection technology creates incomplete versions of what they once were. The Pokédex entries for some fossil Pokemon explicitly state that the revival process is imperfect, that these resurrected creatures may not accurately represent their living ancestors. This acknowledgement that the Pokemon players receive might be flawed reconstructions rather than authentic prehistoric creatures adds unsettling implications to the fossil system, suggesting that every Aerodactyl and Tyrantrum exists in a state of artificial incompleteness. The games never explore this ethical dimension deeply, treating fossil revival as unambiguously positive despite the questions it raises about creating living beings that may be suffering from fundamental biological defects. The Galar fossil system taken this concept to disturbing extremes by allowing players to mix and match fossil halves, creating chimeric creatures that clearly weren't meant to exist, combinations of upper and lower bodies from different species. The resulting Pokemon looked wrong, their proportions grotesque, their movements suggesting discomfort or malfunction. The games treated these creatures as no different from properly matched fossils, but their designs implied suffering, bodies assembled incorrectly that nonetheless lived and battled at the player's command. The willingness to include these obviously wrong combinations suggested a darkly comic sensibility or a commentary on hubris and playing God with ancient DNA. The existence of fossils across multiple regions, while other Pokémon appear to be region specific, raises questions about who these prehistoric creatures relate to modern Pokémon, whether they're ancestors of current species or separate evolutionary lines that went extinct. The games never establish clear relationships between most fossil Pokémon and modern species, treating them as distinct creatures that happen to be ancient rather than as direct predecessors. This approach avoids complicated evolutionary narratives while allowing fossil Pokémon to exist as their own unique category. The legendary birds that appear across multiple generations exemplify how mythological creatures can become recurring elements while adapting to new regions and contexts. Articuno, Zapdos, and Moltres originated in Kanto as rare, powerful creatures with elemental associations, but their reappearances in other regions required explanation. The Crown Tundra expansion for Sword and Shield introduced Galarian forms of these birds with different types and abilities, suggesting that either multiple specimens exist or that regional variants apply even to legendary Pokémon previously thought to be unique. This multiplication of legendaries that were originally presented as singular entities creates continuity problems that the games generally ignore rather than address. If multiple Articuno exist, are they a species rather than individuals? If they're a species, why are they so rare and powerful compared to other Pokémon? The questions reveal tensions between game mechanics that require legendary Pokémon to be catchable and tradable, and narrative framing that presents them as unique, world-shaping entities. The series has never resolved these tensions, allowing both interpretations to coexist uncomfortably. The distribution of legendary Pokémon to every player creates situations where supposedly unique, world-affecting creatures exist in multiple simultaneous timelines, undermining their narrative significance. A legendary Pokémon described as controlling time or maintaining balance between dimensions becomes less impressive when every player can catch one and use it in casual battles. The gameplay necessity of making these creatures accessible conflicts with their mythological importance, reducing gods and world shapers to collectible prizes. Some legendary Pokémon subvert this issue by existing explicitly as species rather than individuals, creatures that are rare and powerful but not unique. The legendary beasts from Generation 2, while requiring special circumstances to encounter, are implied to be Pokémon that can exist in multiple specimens rather than singular entities. This framing makes their legendary status about rarity and power rather than cosmic uniqueness, allowing them to be caught and traded without creating logical contradictions about how multiple players can all possess the same supposedly unique creature. The anime's approach to legendary Pokémon generally treats them as unique individuals with personalities and motivations, creating versions of these creatures that feel more like characters than collectibles. Lugia's appearance in Pokémon 2000 presented it as a specific individual with agency and purpose, very different from the gameplay experience of catching and storing a Lugia in a PC box. This disconnect between anime characterization and game mechanics highlights fundamental differences between how these properties tell stories and what they ask from their audiences. The Mystery Dungeon spin-off series took an entirely different approach to Pokémon, removing human trainers and focusing on Pokémon themselves as protagonists and characters. The player becomes a Pokémon, experiencing the world from their perspective and interacting with other Pokémon as equals rather than as captured creatures in a collection. This shift in perspective revealed possibilities for storytelling that the main series rarely explored, treating Pokémon as fully realized characters with complex emotions and social structures. The choice to transform the player into a Pokémon through mysterious circumstances created narrative framing that allowed exploration of identity and self perception themes that wouldn't work in the main series. The player maintains human consciousness while inhabiting a Pokemon body, creating distance and perspective on what it means to be human versus Pokemon. The games never fully exploit this premise's philosophical potential, but the setup itself asks interesting questions about consciousness and identity that the main series avoids. The partner Pokemon that accompanies the player throughout Mystery Dungeon games develops a relationship that feels more equal and reciprocal than the trainer Pokemon dynamics of main series games. The partner has personality, agency, and narrative importance that rivals or exceeds the player's own, creating a genuine friendship rather than a hierarchical ownership relationship. This partnership model suggests alternative ways of structuring Pokemon relationships that the main series has occasionally approached but never fully embraced. The dungeon crawling gameplay of the Mystery Dungeon series created different strategic considerations than main series battles, with positioning, resource management, and long term planning mattering more than type advantages and individual battle tactics. The roguelike elements, where death meant losing items, and progress created stakes that the main series, with its generous systems for preventing permanent loss, rarely matched. The series attracted players who wanted more challenging gameplay and consequences for failure, though the difficulty and complexity also limited the audience compared to the more accessible main series. The Pokemon Ranger series explored yet another alternative relationship model, where players temporarily partnered with wild Pokemon to solve environmental puzzles rather than capturing them permanently. The Rangers drew circles around Pokemon using the DS stylus, convincing them to help without forcing them into Pokeballs or requiring battles. This cooperation based approach aligned with real world conservation values while creating gameplay that felt distinct from both main series, catching mechanics, and Mystery Dungeon's dungeon crawling. The Ranger games never achieved the popularity of main series titles, perhaps because the circle drawing mechanic became repetitive or because the series' more environmentalist themes felt didactic. But the games demonstrated the flexibility of the Pokemon concept, showing that core ideas about partnering with creatures could translate into wildly different gameplay experiences depending on the framing and mechanics. The series' discontinued status suggests that Nintendo and the Pokemon Company concluded these alternative approaches, while creatively interesting, didn't justify continued development compared to focusing resources on main series entries. The Stadium and Coliseum console games offered experiences that emphasized battling and competition over exploration and collection, creating homes for competitive players who wanted to see their carefully trained teams in full three-dimensional glory on television screens. These games served specific audiences while acknowledging that not all Pokemon fans wanted the same things from the franchise. The split between handheld adventure games and console battle simulators persisted for years before the Switch unified Nintendo's handheld and console lines. The decision to include rental Pokemon in stadium games created interesting situations where players could experiment with high-level, properly trained Pokemon without investing the time to raise them in main series games. This accessibility allowed younger players or those without access to competitive knowledge to experience high-level battling, though the restriction to pre-built teams limited creative team building. The rental system demonstrated understanding that barriers to competitive play could be lowered through thoughtful design choices, though it never fully solved the problem of making competitive Pokemon accessible to casual players. The shadow Pokemon introduced in Colosseum and XD Gale of Darkness represented corrupted creatures that had their hearts closed through cruel experimentation, requiring purification before they could function as normal partners. This darker premise, where Pokemon were explicitly abused and transformed into emotionless fighting machines, pushed against the series' usual lightheartedness. The purification mechanics created gameplay loops around healing and restoration, rather than just capture and training, framing the player as a rescuer saving Pokemon from suffering rather than just a collector. These console spin offs demonstrated appetite for darker, more complex narratives within the Pokemon framework, stories that acknowledged cruelty and corruption while ultimately reaffirming themes of healing and companionship. The games never achieved the popularity of main series entries, possibly because their increased focus on story and darker themes didn't align with what most players wanted from Pokemon experiences. The discontinuation of the Aure games suggested that while players appreciated some narrative complexity, they preferred the lighter tone and adventure focus of main series titles. The trading card game's influence on Pokemon's overall identity cannot be overstated, creating a competitive scene and collectible economy that operated parallel to the video games while drawing from the same creature designs and world. The cards introduced their own rule sets and strategies, where Pokemon functioned as customizable game pieces rather than creatures to train and bond with. This transformation from companion to game piece represented yet another interpretation of what Pokemon could be, how these designs could support different forms of play and competition. The rarity tiers and chase cards that defined TCG collecting created markets where individual cards could be worth hundreds or thousands of dollars, far exceeding the cost of any video game. The Charizard from the first English set became iconic partially because of its gameplay strength, but mostly because of its rarity and striking artwork, creating a card that symbolized the entire hobby for casual observers. The economics of high-value cards brought speculation and investment culture into a children's card game, creating complicated relationships where cards were simultaneously toys and assets. The progression of the TCG through various mechanical eras mirrored the video game's evolution, with new card types, abilities, and rule changes keeping the game fresh across decades. The willingness to rotate older cards out of tournament play while allowing them in casual contexts managed power creep while preserving accessibility for new players. This rotation system acknowledged that continuous expansion would eventually make the game unwieldy if every card remained legal forever, prioritizing long-term health over preserving every player's investment. The relationship between the video games and TCG remained mostly separate, with different companies managing each and limited mechanical overlap between them. But the shared artwork and designs created visual coherence across both properties, ensuring that Pokemon looked consistent whether appearing on screens or cards. This visual consistency helped maintain Pokemon as a unified brand rather than fragmenting into incompatible interpretations, keeping the core designs recognizable even as they appeared in wildly different contexts. The passage of years has created generations of players who grew up with Pokemon and now share it with their children, creating multi-generational fan bases where parents and children can engage with the same property through different lenses. Older players bring nostalgia and deeper knowledge, while younger players approach games with fresh perspectives, unburdened by expectations formed across decades. The series' longevity has created unusual situations where grandparents might play the same games as grandchildren, though perhaps with very different priorities and levels of investment. This multi-generational appeal requires careful balance in game design, creating experiences accessible to children experiencing Pokemon for the first time, while including enough depth and complexity to engage adults who've been playing for 25 years. The main series has generally prioritized accessibility, sometimes frustrating experienced players who want more challenge, while spin offs and post game content provide harder experiences for those seeking them. The compromise satisfies neither group perfectly, but allows the series to maintain broad appeal across age ranges. The Nuzlocke Challenge and other player created difficulty modifications demonstrate how communities can reshape games to suit their needs when official difficulty options feel insufficient. The Nuzlocke's simple rules, allowing only one catch per route and permanently releasing fainted Pokémon, transform Pokémon games into genuinely challenging experiences where decisions carry weight and failure has consequences. The challenge spread through community sharing and streaming, becoming so popular that it represents an entirely separate way of engaging with games that their designers never explicitly intended. The willingness of players to impose artificial constraints on themselves to create challenge reveals both the game's flexibility and their perceived lack of difficulty at base settings. Players want to love Pokemon games, but sometimes feel unchallenged by their default configurations, leading to creative solutions that preserve the core experience while adding stakes and tension. The community driven nature of these challenges means they evolve continuously, with players creating variations and spin offs that explore different aspects of difficulty and restriction. Game Freak has occasionally acknowledged these player created challenges through subtle design choices, like including optional restrictions or difficulty settings in some titles, but has never fully embraced hardcore playstyles in the main series. The reluctance stems partly from the series' identity as accessible and welcoming, concerned that official hard modes might alienate the broad audience that has sustained Pokemon for decades. The tension between serving dedicated fans and maintaining accessibility continues to shape design decisions across new releases. The speedrunning community has found entirely different ways to engage with Pokemon games, treating them as optimization puzzles where the goal is completion in minimum time. The strategies developed through speedrunning often exploit glitches, use probability manipulation, and sequence break in ways that completely subvert intended progression. These playthroughs bear little resemblance to normal experiences, transforming adventure games into precise technical exercises where every action serves the singular goal of reducing completion time. The knowledge required for high-level speedrunning includes frame-perfect inputs, understanding of random number generation, and mastery of glitches that can skip major portions of games. This specialized expertise creates communities dedicated to discovering and documenting techniques, sharing knowledge that allows new runners to build on previous innovations. The collaborative nature of speedrunning, where improvements benefit everyone through shared knowledge, contrasts with more competitive gaming scenes, where advantages are guarded secrets. World record attempts and major speedrun events have brought attention to Pokémon as competitive endeavor separate from sanctioned tournament play, demonstrating appeal that extends beyond collecting and battling into pure technical mastery. The speedrunning community provides yet another example of how Pokemon's framework supports diverse engagement modes, allowing players to find meaningful challenge and achievement, regardless of official design intentions. The flexibility that enables speedrunning to exist and thrive speaks to robust underlying systems that withstand being pushed far beyond intended use cases. The realm hacking community has created entirely new Pokemon experiences by modifying game code and assets, producing fan games that range from simple difficulty adjustments to completely original stories with new regions and creatures. These modifications exist in legal gray areas, using Nintendo's intellectual property without permission, but they fill gaps that official releases don't address, providing harder challenges, darker narratives, and experimental mechanics that Game Freak wouldn't risk in commercial products. Some ROM hacks have achieved significant popularity with dedicated fan bases that rival smaller indie games audiences. The quality and ambition of top tier hacks demonstrate the creativity and technical skill present in Pokemon's fan base. Players who love the series enough to spend hundreds of hours creating content that honors it while pushing in new directions. The relationship between Nintendo and the ROM hacking community remains complicated, with periodic cease and desist letters creating tension, while many hacks operate openly for years without legal intervention. The existence of these fan made experiences reveals appetite for Pokemon content that official releases don't satisfy, creating parallel ecosystems where players can find experiences unavailable through legitimate channels. The community's willingness to create and share these modifications demonstrates investment that goes beyond passive consumption, transforming players into active participants in expanding and reinterpreting the series. This creative engagement enriches Pokemon culture while occasionally creating friction with official copyright holders who must balance protecting intellectual property against alienating passionate fans. The emergence of Pokemon Go as cultural phenomenon in 2016 demonstrated the franchise's ability to capture mainstream attention decades after its initial release, creating a mobile experience that brought Pokemon into physical spaces through augmented reality. The game's launch created unprecedented scenes of crowds gathering in public spaces to catch virtual creatures, transforming parks and landmarks into active playing spaces. The success validated mobile gaming as viable platform for major Pokemon releases, while also demonstrating appetite for experiences that diverge significantly from main series formulas. The social dynamics that emerged around Pokemon Go raids and community days created new forms of Pokemon-focused gathering, events where strangers coordinated through apps and social media to accomplish shared goals. These gatherings recaptured some of the communal energy that defined Pokemon's early years, when link cables connected players physically rather than through wireless internet. The face-to-face interaction required by location-based gameplay created opportunities for community building that purely online games can't replicate. The game's accessibility, compared to main series titles, brought in audiences who had never played traditional Pokemon games, casual mobile gamers who recognized the characters but had no experience with deeper mechanics. This expanded audience demonstrated Pokemon's cultural penetration beyond dedicated gaming communities, proving that the character designs and basic concepts could carry experiences even without the strategic depth of main series battles. The simplified catching and battling mechanics prioritized accessibility over complexity, creating an entry point that eventually led some players toward more traditional games. The ongoing updates and events that have sustained Pokemon Go years after launch demonstrate the potential of games as service models for Pokemon properties. The continuous content additions, seasonal events, and community activities create reasons for regular engagement that single purchase games can't match. This model has influenced thinking about how Pokemon experiences might evolve, though main series games have retained traditional purchase models while incorporating some live service elements through post-launch distributions and limited time events. The Let's Go games released for Switch represented a bridge between Pokemon Go's accessibility and main series depth, incorporating Go's catching mechanics while reintroducing traditional trainer battles and progression systems. The games served as testing ground for how main series entries might work on Switch, while also providing accessible entry point for players whose only Pokemon experience was Go. The simplified mechanics frustrated some traditional fans, while welcoming others who appreciated the streamlined experience. The decision to make wild encounters visible rather than random represented significant departure from series tradition, allowing players to see which Pokemon they would encounter rather than forcing them into every tall grass encounter. This change reduced friction and made progression feel more deliberate, though it also removed the element of surprise that defined earlier games' exploration. The mixed reception demonstrated how changes that improve accessibility can simultaneously diminish elements that core fans valued. The partner Pikachu, or EV, that accompanied players throughout Let's Go, sitting on their head or shoulder, provided constant companionship that reinforced the bond between trainer and Pokémon. This visual presence made the partner feel more like a character than a battle tool, recalling the anime's portrayal of Ash and Pikachu's relationship. The mechanic demonstrated growing interest in making individual Pokemon feel important and characterized rather than treating them as interchangeable collection items. The interconnection between Let's Go and Pokemon Go through transfer features created synergy between properties, encouraging engagement with both games through mutual benefits. Players could transfer Pokemon from Go to Let's Go to complete collections, while Go benefited from the increased engagement these transfers encouraged. This cross-property integration suggested future direction for the franchise, creating ecosystems where engagement with one Pokemon property enhanced experiences in others. The Pokemon Home Cloud service expanded this cross-game integration significantly, creating centralized storage that persisted across titles while enabling transfers between vastly different game types. The service acknowledged that long-term fans had invested decades into building collections spread across multiple games and platforms, providing a way to consolidate and preserve those collections. The subscription model monetized this preservation, transforming what had been a feature included in games into an ongoing service requiring payment. The decision to charge for cloud storage of Pokémon drew criticism from players who felt they were being forced to pay to access creatures they had legitimately obtained and owned. The counter-argument that server maintenance and development costs justified subscription fees highlighted tensions between preserving player collections and sustainable business models. The debate revealed differing expectations about what owning Pokémon meant in a digital age where games as service models increasingly dominated. The trading features built into Pokémon Home revived some of the social elements that had defined earlier trading systems, though the shift to online global trading lacked the personal connection of local wireless exchanges. The Wonder Trade system, allowing random trades with strangers worldwide, created moments of surprise and delight, while also being vulnerable to exploitation by players dumping unwanted Pokémon. The balance between maintaining trading as social feature and preventing abuse of anonymous online systems remained challenging. The global trade system that had existed in various forms across generations attempted to create efficient trading marketplace while preserving some element of personal choice and negotiation. The system's imperfections, particularly the prevalence of impossible trade requests from players asking for legendary Pokémon in exchange for common creatures, demonstrated challenges in creating functional player-driven economies without heavy moderation. The persistence of these impossible trades across years suggested limited effort to curate or moderate the system, accepting dysfunction as acceptable cost of player freedom. The sleep tracking features introduced through Pokémon Sleep represented another attempt to expand the franchise into new areas of players' lives, this time literally monitoring their rest to encourage healthy sleep habits. The concept of using Pokémon to promote wellness extended the brand into lifestyle category, suggesting that Pokémon could be framework for self-improvement rather than just entertainment. The success of this approach remained uncertain, as convincing players to use their phones as sleep monitors required overcoming both technical limitations and privacy concerns. The gamification of sleep tracking through catching Pokémon based on sleep quality attempted to make healthy behavior rewarding in immediate, tangible ways. The concept aligned with broader trends toward wellness apps and quantified self-tracking, though whether gamification genuinely promotes better habits versus just making people more anxious about sleep data remains debatable. The application of Pokemon's motivational framework to real world behavior marked interesting evolution in how the franchise understood its relationship with players' lives. The Pokemon Cafe Remix and other casual mobile games expanded the franchise into match 3 puzzle territory, using familiar characters to draw players into gameplay that had nothing to do with traditional Pokemon mechanics. These titles demonstrated the raw marketing power of Pokemon designs, characters recognizable and beloved enough to carry experiences completely divorced from their original context. The success of these casual titles, alongside more traditional games, showed appetite for Pokemon content across a spectrum of complexity and commitment levels. The merchandising empire that has surrounded Pokemon since its beginning extends far beyond games into every imaginable product category, from clothing to home goods to food products. The ubiquity of Pokemon imagery creates situations where the characters exist as cultural touchstones separate from their gaming origins, recognized by people who have never played a Pokemon game or watched an episode of the anime. This cultural penetration transforms Pokemon from entertainment franchise into genuine phenomenon, part of the visual language of contemporary culture. The Pokemon centers that exist as retail destinations in Japan and increasingly in other countries create physical spaces dedicated entirely to Pokemon merchandise and experiences. These stores function as pilgrimages sites for dedicated fans, destinations where the concentration of Pokemon related products and exclusive items creates shopping experiences impossible to replicate online. The success of these physical retail spaces in an increasingly digital age demonstrates the enduring appeal of tangible, in-person engagement with beloved franchises. The center's role extends beyond simple retail into creating community spaces where fans gather, trade, and share their enthusiasm with others who understand it. The normalization of adult Pokemon fandom these spaces enable, where spending significant money on plush toys or collectibles is accepted and encouraged rather than judged, creates refuge from broader cultural skepticism about adult engagement with children's media. The spaces acknowledge that Pokemon's audience spans all ages, and that providing for adult fans is legitimate business strategy and appropriate response to genuine demand. The yearly anniversary celebrations that mark Pokemon's ongoing history create cyclical moments of reflection and nostalgia, opportunities to look back at the franchise's evolution while anticipating future directions. These anniversaries bring special distributions, commemorative merchandise, and sometimes significant announcements about upcoming releases. The rituals around these celebrations reinforce Pokemon as ongoing narrative rather than series of discrete products, creating a sense of continuity and forward momentum that maintains engagement between major releases. The 25th anniversary celebration in 2021 demonstrated the scale Pokemon celebrations can achieve with coordinated announcements, products, and events spanning months and involving collaborations with major brands across multiple industries. The ambition of these celebrations reflects confidence in the franchise's cultural significance and willingness to treat Pokemon milestones as events worthy of broad attention. The success of anniversary marketing demonstrates how nostalgia and milestone moments can be monetized while genuinely providing fans with content and experiences they value. As quiet settles deeper and thoughts slow into the rhythm that precedes sleep, the accumulated details about Pokemon begin to blur together, individual facts becoming part of larger understanding about what this franchise represents and how it has functioned across decades. The persistence of Pokemon despite changing technologies, evolving player expectations, and shifting cultural contexts demonstrates remarkable adaptability, willingness to evolve, while maintaining enough core identity to remain recognizable. The facts we've explored tonight, from mechanical quirks to design decisions to community practices, all contribute to the rich tapestry that is Pokemon fandom and culture. They represent countless hours of creative work, millions of players' engagement and investment, and the accumulated wisdom of a community that has grown alongside the franchise. These details matter not because any individual fact is essential, but because collectively they demonstrate the depth and complexity that emerges when something is sustained, iterated upon, and loved across generations. The preservation of this knowledge through documentation, discussion, and sharing ensures that understanding of Pokemon's history and development remains accessible to new generations of players. The willingness of fans to maintain wikis, create video essays, and compile databases represents investment that goes beyond entertainment into genuine scholarship and preservation. This community-driven documentation serves crucial function in maintaining institutional memory as older games and systems become obsolete, ensuring that knowledge isn't lost simply because the hardware that hosted it no longer functions. The modding communities that create tools to extract data from games, document undiscovered features, and preserve development materials perform archival work that official sources rarely undertake. The leaked development files, beta versions, and unused content that surface periodically provide glimpses into creative processes that would otherwise remain hidden. This preservation work exists in legal gray areas, extracting and sharing data from copyrighted materials without explicit permission, but it serves legitimate historical and educational purposes that benefit everyone interested in understanding how games are made. The balance between respecting intellectual property and preserving gaming history remains unresolved, with legitimate arguments on both sides about whether this documentation and archival work should be celebrated or condemned. The reality is that without fan efforts, much of gaming history would be lost to time, unavailable for study or appreciation by future generations. The legal frameworks that govern these activities were created for different contexts and often fail to accommodate the genuine preservation needs of digital media. The Pokemon Company's relationship with fan creators, modders, and preservationists has been inconsistent, sometimes acknowledging and even celebrating fan works, while other times issuing takedowns and cease and desist notices. This inconsistency creates uncertainty about what activities are acceptable and which will provoke legal response, chilling some creative and archival efforts while others continue operating openly. The lack of clear guidelines leaves fan communities navigating ambiguous territory, never quite certain which projects will be tolerated and which will be shut down. The fan art community has flourished despite these legal uncertainties, creating massive amounts of original artwork inspired by Pokemon designs and characters. The sheer volume of fan-created content rivals or exceeds official artwork in quantity, if not always in quality, demonstrating the creative inspiration Pokemon designs provide. The community-driven nature of fan art creates ecosystems where artists build audiences and reputations through their interpretations of beloved characters, sometimes achieving fame within the community that rivals or exceeds official artists. The various art styles and interpretations that fans bring to Pokemon characters expand the aesthetic range of the franchise beyond official representations, exploring possibilities that commercial products can't risk. Darker, more mature interpretations coexist with cute and wholesome ones, realistic renderings, alongside stylized abstractions, creating diverse visual culture around shared character designs. This multiplicity of interpretations enriches Pokemon's presence in visual culture, ensuring the characters remain vibrant and relevant across different artistic contexts. The shipping communities that form around Pokemon characters, imagining romantic or platonic relationships that games never explicitly depict, represent another form of creative engagement that extends beyond passive consumption. These communities create narratives, artwork, and discussions around character dynamics, investing emotional energy into relationships that exist more in imagination than in official canon. The tolerance for these communities, as long as they remain appropriate and respect boundaries around characters depicted as minors, demonstrates how fan engagement can expand universes in directions their creators never explicitly authorized. The competitive Pokemon community represents the most mechanically sophisticated engagement with the games, players who understand systems at levels that casual players never approach. The metagame analysis, damage calculations, and strategic planning that define high-level competitive play transform Pokemon from children's games into complex strategy experiences with skill ceilings that rival traditional competitive games. The community's dedication to understanding and optimizing every aspect of battle mechanics creates knowledge bases that exceed anything official guides provide. The distinction between official tournament formats and informal competitive play creates multiple communities with different values and priorities. The video game championships represent official competitive scene with standardized rules and formats that change yearly to keep competition fresh. The informal communities on battle simulators, like Pokemon Showdown, operate under different rules, often using formats that explore aspects of competitive play that official tournaments don't emphasize. The coexistence of these communities demonstrates how different groups can find meaningful competition within the same basic framework. The tier system that organizes Pokemon by competitive viability creates structure that allows players to use their favorites without being forced to compete against statistically superior threats. The separation of Pokemon into OU, UU, RU, and lower tiers ensures that even weaker creatures can find competitive contexts where they're viable, where their unique characteristics can shine, rather than being overshadowed by legendary Pokemon and pseudo-legendaries. This tier system represents community response to balance issues that official formats don't address, creating more equitable competitive environments through voluntary restriction. The discussion and debate around tier placements, which Pokemon belong in which competitive contexts, creates ongoing conversation about balance and viability that keeps communities engaged between generations. The tier shifts that occur as players discover new strategies or when move tutor availability changes keep the metagame dynamic, ensuring that competitive play doesn't stagnate into solved puzzles. The democratic nature of tier assignments through usage statistics means the community collectively determines what counts as competitively viable, though debates about whether usage equals power create ongoing friction. The content creators who build audiences through Pokemon-focused videos, streams, and written content have created an economy around the franchise where knowledge and entertainment become monetizable products. The most successful Pokemon content creators earn significant income through advertising, sponsorships, and donations, transforming hobby into career through audience building and consistent output. This professionalization of Pokemon content creation represents another way the franchise generates value beyond direct game sales, creating entire industries around discussion, analysis, and entertainment related to these games. The variety of content types, from competitive battle analysis to shiny hunting streams to challenge runs to lore discussions, ensures that creators can find niches where their particular interests and expertise provide value to audiences. The abundance of Pokemon content creates situations where fans can engage with the franchise continuously through others' play and commentary, even when not actively playing themselves. This parasocial relationship with content creators and their Pokemon journeys extends engagement beyond personal play into vicarious experience of others' adventures and achievements. The nostalgia that permeates much Pokemon discussion, the constant references to earlier generations, and longing for aspects of older games reflects the franchise's multi-generational audience and the powerful memories that these games create during formative years. For many players, Pokemon represents not just entertainment, but connection to childhood, to simpler times when catching creatures and exploring regions felt genuinely magical and new. This nostalgic lens colors perceptions of new releases, creating situations where innovations are judged against idealized memories rather than actual qualities of older games. The endless debates about which generation was best, which region was most well designed, which set of Pokemon designs was strongest, rarely reach consensus because they're fundamentally about personal experience and when players first encountered the franchise. The generation you played first almost inevitably becomes the standard against which others are judged, creating biases that rational analysis can't fully overcome. This subjective dimension to quality judgments means that discussions about Pokemon excellence often talk past each other, with participants defending their own nostalgic connections rather than engaging with games on their actual merits. The recognitions of this nostalgic bias, the understanding that our love for specific games or generations reflects when we encountered them rather than objective superiority, allows for more productive discussions that acknowledge personal preference while still attempting to evaluate games fairly. The best Pokemon discourse makes space for both subjective emotional response and attempts at objective analysis, recognizing that both perspectives offer value and neither fully captures why these games matter to people. The coexistence of passionate personal attachment and critical distance defines mature engagement with media that has shaped childhoods and continues influencing adulthoods. The future directions that Pokemon might take remain uncertain, with each new generation introducing mechanics and features that might become permanent additions or might be abandoned after single implementations. The history of temporary mechanics, like Mega Evolution, Z-Moves, and Dynamax, suggests that Game Freak values novelty over long-term consistency, preferring to introduce fresh systems even if that means abandoning features players loved. This approach keeps games feeling new but creates frustration among players who invest in mastering mechanics only to see them discarded in subsequent generations. The tension between innovation and preservation of beloved features defines many design decisions, with developers needing to balance introducing novel experiences against maintaining elements that define Pokemon identity. The core loop of catching, training, and battling remains consistent, but the systems surrounding that loop continue evolving in ways that sometimes enhance and sometimes complicate the basic formula. The challenge of innovating without losing what makes Pokemon special will continue shaping design choices as the franchise progresses. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed drifting through these quiet moments, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. Let it play while you rest. You might discover something gentle before sleep takes you again.